nearly 200 different participants involved. We've got a very exciting program today, which will be today exploring Shastra hermeneutics and the central role of philosophy. The session in total will last 3 hours. We've got 6 different presentations, and there will be opportunities for entering questions as they go along. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom, and we may not be able to take all the questions for each speaker as we go along, but there will be a chance at the end for a panel discussion, and possibly we can feed some of the questions in at that stage. So I'd like to start immediately on this theme. As I said, Shastra, hermeneutics, and the central role of philosophy. And I'd like to introduce His Holiness Hridayananda Goswami, also known as Dr. Howard Resnick, and he is the Dean of the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies, our key project based in Gainesville, Florida, and he's a founding member of the Institute of Vaishnav Studies. He received his bachelorship at UCLA, but did his PhD at Harvard. That PhD dissertation is published in the Harvard Oriental series, and he has published quite extensively with Harvard. We're very fortunate to have him here, and I'm going to pass over immediately to Dr. Howard Resnick. Thank you.
Thank you, Kandidi. So my goal here is to demonstrate that it is an analytic truth that empirical science can never necessarily give a complete description of reality. So I want to explain what some of these terms mean. First of all, what is an analytic truth? An analytic truth is something which is necessarily true simply by the definitions of words. For example, if I say that figure A is a parallelogram, or let's say a rectangle, then it's necessarily true that it's not a triangle, or it's necessarily true that it's not a circle. Or for example, if I say that John is a bachelor, it's necessarily true that John is not married. So an analytic truth means if you simply analyze, if you simply understand what the words mean, then something either must be true or cannot be true. And so if we simply analyze words like empiricism, then it becomes an analytic truth, not a truth that is the result of investigation and testing, but it is an analytic truth. It is necessarily true that we can never say with certainty that science has given us a complete description of reality. And so I'm going to explain briefly what I mean, and then we're going to go through this, and we're going to talk about the philosophy of knowledge. It is perhaps the cardinal principle of empiricism that a theory has to be tested. It has to be subjected to some kind of controlled experiment. Even, for example, the Webb telescope is obviously an empirical device because it depends upon scientists having access, visual access, to a certain degree and in certain ways, because, you know, to be visible can mean many things. But to a relevant degree, the telescope must have access to certain aspects of the universe. Now, to have access to something, to be able to look at something, is a kind of control. For example, let's say another person is not under your control. You can't simply walk into their house. You can't simply barge into their office. You can't demand to see that person. So even having visual access to someone or to something is a type of control. So obviously, if you try to investigate the universe through controlled experiments, you can never know with certainty or you can never necessarily know things that are beyond your control. So when we empirically study the universe and say there's nothing out there which we could call divine or spiritual, that's like taking a thermometer out into the world and then saying there's nothing in the world except temperature. It's absurd. It's silly. And so because empiricism depends upon the controlled experiment, it can only study things that scientists can control, and it cannot study things that scientists cannot control. So logically, we have no grounds on which to say a priori, that means before investigation, before offering any proof, that nothing exists in the universe except things that we can control. If you make that statement, it's not an empirical statement, it's a philosophical statement, and it's a pretty silly one. So that's the first thesis, and we're going to get into this, that the empirical method analytically, by the definition of what it is, can never necessarily give a complete description of reality. And when we want to study things that are perhaps greater than ourselves or simply non-empirical, then going back to the language of the school of Aristotle, roughly 2,500 years ago, we have physics and we have metaphysics, that which is beyond physics. So let us continue. Fortunately, many of the most famous philosophers, including philosophers of science, have admitted what I just said. So here are some quotations. For example, one of the most famous philosophers of our time, John Searle of Berkeley, in a book published by the MIT Press, said, "I believe in the physicalist worldview. This is just my religious faith. And I think that physicalism is probably just my religion." That's coming from an atheist, physicalist, very famous philosopher, unquote. Here's another quote from a very famous atheist philosopher who passed away very recently. Quote, "There is a strange inversion in religious fervor. Those who possess no faith, no supernatural beliefs, are often the ones who hold their views most fiercely and with the most unshakable conviction. It's as though atheism itself were a kind of religion, demanding no less faith than theism." Unquote. Here's a quote from the notorious Dawkins from his book, The God Delusion. Quote, "My faith is that science works. This may seem like a kind of religious belief, and in a way, it is." Unquote. Another quote from, in this case, one of the great historians of religion from the 20th century, and a friend of the devotees, Houston Smith, very famous. His books were used everywhere as textbooks. Quote, "In the modern West, scientific materialism has become a de facto religion, promising a complete understanding of reality," unquote. Here's one from Thomas Nagel, the very famous atheist philosopher. "I want atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God. I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that," unquote. So at least these people were philosophers. Scientists often, and I don't mean most scientists, but the ones who tend to be the loudest in public, scientists often know so little about philosophy that when making philosophical claims, they naively believe that they're making scientific claims. So I want to put all this in historical context. Literally for thousands of years, you could say, at least a few thousand years, throughout Western intellectual history, everyone had the common sense to understand that there are two different dimensions to reality, a physical and a metaphysical dimension. And this language, by the way, goes back to the school of Aristotle. So one person who espoused this was Galileo, who's often depicted as this heroic opponent of religious fanaticism. Why he was actually tried and put under house arrest is a very different story. If you know the real history, basically is because he was incredibly obnoxious and publicly tried to humiliate the Pope. The church, by the way, at that time was actually keenly interested in heliocentrism. But anyway, even Galileo said famously that religion can tell us how to go to heaven, but it cannot tell us how the heavens go. In other words, they can do theology. They should not try to do astronomy. So even Galileo said that. So the attempt of physicalism masquerading as science, the attempt to monopolize knowledge and tell us whether there even is a heaven to go to, it's sort of an equal and opposite fanaticism. As the philosopher Hegel pointed out, the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and of course Newton talks about the third law of motion. Every force creates an equal and opposite force. Plato talks about one political extreme producing its opposite extreme, so that anarchy produces tyranny, tyranny produces anarchy, and so on. Or Galileo, who actually first talked about the pendulum effect. So they're all saying the same thing, really. And so you have this history of a very oppressive, fanatical religion in Europe, and it produces its equal and opposite extreme, a fanatical, irrational scientism, or the fanatical claim for the powers of science. And so, in a sense, what I'm arguing for here, and I'll say more about this, is that after this aberration, where the historical balance, which actually lasted practically 2,000 years, where physics and metaphysics, which means what is beyond physics, were seen as simply two branches of knowledge, that a complete understanding of reality required us to understand both. Of course, with the rise of science, scientific revolution, the church began to intervene in science. And when science started to stray from church doctrine, they opposed it. This produced a reaction. Power corrupts. As the application of the scientific revolution, which is the Industrial Revolution, began to gain more and more power and to make human life so much better, then the empiricists became corrupted by their power, exactly in the same way the church had become corrupted by their power, and they became aphilosophical fanatics, which you see manifest in the atheistic university. So now, fortunately, for various historical reasons I won't go into right now, things are moving back toward the center. There is a rebalancing going on where we can accept that a complete understanding of reality requires us to understand both the physical and the metaphysical. That's where history is moving right now, and it's a very positive thing. It's a rebalancing, a re-articulation of a very ancient equilibrium of knowledge. So now the idea that physical, one point which I'm going to quote here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is that as a sociological principle, when you have a group of people who all kind of believe something, then the standard for evidence in order to affirm that belief goes down. I mean, to give a simple example, if you're giving a sermon in a, let's say, a Christian or Catholic church, and you talk about the salvific power of Jesus, you don't have to do a lot of philosophy, and you don't do anything like empirical proof, because you're preaching to the choir. Similarly, this is what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says about preaching to the choir among atheist scientists and philosophers. Quote, "The first thing to say when considering the truth of physicalism, the first thing to say is that we live in an overwhelmingly physicalist or materialist intellectual culture. Thus, as things currently stand, the standards of argumentation required to persuade someone of the truth of physicalism are much lower than standards required to refute it. And there's a few words paraphrasing it. I'll repeat that. As things currently stand, the standards, in other words, within an academic community, the standards of argumentation required to persuade someone of the truth of physicalism are much lower than the standards required to refute it. So the general point is, if you already believe or want to believe something to be true, you are likely to accept fairly low standards of argumentation for its truth. And I already quoted some of the most, perhaps the most famous atheist philosophers of our time, who at least had enough decency and intelligence to admit that atheism or physicalism is their religion, because a priori, you can't prove it. Maybe I'll just say a word about that, why it's actually logically impossible to prove empiricism. The nature of empiricism, and this is called in philosophy, it's called the problem of empiricism, is that you can show a very, very high probability, but you can never absolutely prove something. Let's say, for example, it's a scientific fact that there are no unicorns wandering about, let's say, the state of Massachusetts. Now, no one's ever seen a unicorn in Massachusetts, and therefore it seems extremely probable that there are no unicorns in Massachusetts. However, it's not necessarily true. It does not violate the rules of logic to say that there is a group of unicorns that are so shy about human contact, they've been very cleverly hiding from humans for centuries. That is not a contradiction in terms. It's not like saying there's a square circle or that John is a married bachelor. There's no linguistic contradiction. Therefore, it's logically possible, even if empirically it's extremely unlikely. So anyway, moving on. One of the persons who, perhaps the scholar who most famously and most powerfully showed that scholars tend to come to conclusions, especially when it's groupthink, when, like, if you don't think this way, you're basically not going to get a job in a good university, your papers won't be published, and so on. So the person who most powerfully pointed out that scholars, including scientists, are not simply arguing for things or coming to conclusions based 100% on the evidence, the person that showed this is Thomas Kuhn. In his very famous book from the 1960s, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And what he showed is that there are no rules. There are no rules for, and this is again from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there are no rules for deciding the significance of a logical problem in a scientific paradigm. For example, I pointed out a logical problem in the scientific paradigm, namely that that a priori, by definition, can never investigate things that are greater than human beings. And therefore, empirical science can never rule out such things because their methodology does not allow them to study such things. So, but what Kuhn pointed out is that in real scientific communities, never mind what's logical or illogical, but in the actual human communities, there are no rules for deciding the significance of a logical problem in the scientific paradigm. For example, the fact that empiricism a priori can never study things greater than ourselves, that's a logical problem if one's intention is to say that empiricism is giving a complete picture of reality, or at least the best or most complete picture of reality that human beings can achieve at this point in history. So that's a logical problem. So how much does that logical problem bother scientists? How seriously do they take that logical problem? To what extent do they make adjustments in their claims because of that serious logical problem? What the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says is that there are no rules for deciding the significance, as Kuhn pointed out, of that logical problem. The decision to opt for a revision of a ruling paradigm, the decision, okay, we have this paradigm, let's say now it's physicalism, so the decision like, hey, maybe we should revise that sectarian physicalist paradigm is not rationally compelled. In other words, the history of science shows that scientists do not adjust their paradigms because it has logical problems. There are sociological problems. Well, anyway, I won't go into Kuhn any more than that. But nor is the particular choice of revision rationally compelled. So just to give a simple example, with God or without God, we have a fossil record. So whether or not there's a God, there is a fossil record. And empirically, a priori, analytically, you cannot empirically show that God, let's say, ultimately designed biological evolution, and you can't show that he didn't. Of course, if God decided to make it empirically obvious, let's say God actually came down to earth and said, watch, and then started creating all kinds of evolutes, that'd be different. But with the knowledge we have now, we cannot empirically say that God did or did not bring about the evolution of species. Thus, the notion of unguided evolution, or for that matter of unguided cosmogenesis, is a view held on faith. It's not a scientific view. And actually, it demonstrates the corruption of empirical science by the inclusion of non-empirical metaphysical assumptions, such as evolution occurred exclusively by natural causes, which is not an empirical theory, can never be proved, and is actually a corruption of empirical science. So to prove God or not prove God, they are equally, in evolution, are equally beyond the range of empiricism. So how do we know things, ultimately? What is the method by which we actually claim to know things with certainty? The most reliable, the most popular method for the last 2,500 years, and a method introduced by Aristotle again, is called foundationalism. And interestingly, foundationalism is also found in Vedanta Sutra, in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and other scriptures in the Mahabharata. So it's also taught in our Shastras. So I'll explain what foundationalism is. Aristotle's the one that pointed this out. He said that when you're trying to prove something, you can be pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. Let's say a very simple empirical fact that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So someone doubts that. Someone says, prove it. So I put a pot of water on the stove. I put a thermometer in there, and the water boils at 100 degrees. But the person pushes me back one step and says, I don't believe that's pure water. I think that you might have put some chemical in the water, some invisible chemical in the water that changes the boiling point. So you have to test the water. But then again, you have to test the water testing chemicals, and those have to be tested. Or you have to test the mercury, then you have to test the mercury testing chemicals. In other words, you're pushed into an infinite, unending regress of proofs. Aristotle says since no one is going to live that long, therefore, if we allow this, then no one can ever claim to know anything, and yet we believe we do know things. Therefore, Aristotle said there must be a first or primary principle, a foundational claim not requiring demonstration or proof. I'll give you a simple example of that. You go to sleep at night, you dream, you wake up, you make a quick decision that the world you're experiencing in your awake state is more real, somehow ontologically is more real than the world of your dream state. You can't prove it. Your dream is not empirically available. Or, for example, your belief in yesterday. But I'll go into those things, some of the foundational beliefs, because you can't empirically prove yesterday. So, because you're not directly experiencing it. Now, this problem of an infinite regress of proofs and the need to escape this regress by affirming sincerely a self-evident foundation This is found in Nyaya, in the traditional Indian system of logic. In Nyaya, it's called anavastha. Avastha means a foundation. So anavastha means you have no foundation for your knowledge, and therefore you have to establish an avastha, foundation. In the Brahma Sutra 2.111, we find the statement tarka pratishtanat, because tarka, mere logic, is not the foundation. Logic simply analyzes the relationships between affirmations. It cannot say the affirmations are true or not. That's empiricism, or it's metaphysical realization. So therefore, logic itself, tarka, apratishtanat, because it's not a foundation, anyatanumeyam, leads one to sort of infer, speculate otherwise, and therefore one can never come to liberating knowledge. So Brahma Sutra recognizes the problem of an infinite regress of proofs, or not having an epistemic foundation. The Mahabharata, in a verse, actually, anyway, I won't go into the technical details of which manuscript is found in, but is tarko apratishta. Logic is not a foundation. And then, of course, Shrutayo vibhina, there are various scriptures and so on. But let's just focus on that first part of the verse, that tarko apratishta. Now, Lord Chaitanya quotes the same thing. Lord Chaitanya quotes this in the Chaitanya Charitamrita in verse 2:17, 186, that tarko apratishta, that logic is not the foundation. And so the need for a pratishta, now Lord Chaitanya will say that swata pramana veda, just as Aristotle said that you need a self-evident truth, which will be the foundation on which you build, just like when you're building a house, no foundation, no house. So Lord Chaitanya preached both to Prakashananda and to Sarvabhauma. I won't give the verse numbers here, but you can look them up. He said, swata pramana veda. Veda, in the larger sense of Veda, including Bhagavad Gita, is evidence. It is proof, swataha, by itself. So the idea that that mere logic is not a foundation, the real foundation is a self-evident truth, it was taught by Lord Chaitanya himself. He calls it pramana shiromani, the crown jewel of evidence. And again, that was to Prakashananda, to Sarvabhauma, same thing, swata pramana veda. The Veda by itself is evidence. And yekoi lakshana korile, one who tries to interpret, speculate about this, swata pramanya hani hoy, you destroy the self-evident quality of the Shastra. So now, how do you get a self-evident starting point? Like, for example, in geometry, something has to be given. So where do you get foundational starting points? Here, I want to go to the Bhagavad Gita, because Krishna explains something very important about this. That, so from a socio-historical perspective, first I want to talk about how you get foundational starting points in a sociological sense, rather than just a philosophical sense. Krishna makes some very important statements in the Bhagavad Gita 17:2. He says, Trividha bhavati shraddha, that faith, really having confidence in something, comes in three varieties. And subhavaja, it's born of one's own nature. And these are, of course, in the mode of goodness, passion, and ignorance. And then Krishna says at 17:3 that satanu rupa sarvasya, Shraddha bhavati bharata, a faith, a conviction arises in everyone. There is no conscious being that doesn't have faith in something, even if it's faith that it's in your rational self-interest to get out of bed in the morning. So philosophy is like psychology. You may not study it, but you have one. If you do anything intentionally, and you can't, and Krishna says you can't not act intentionally, because even if you, let's say, decide I'm not going to do anything, that's an intentional act. To hold yourself motionless or not to act is an action. So because you're a living being, you must constantly choose to do something. When you choose to do something, you are enacting your value system. Your value system is your philosophy. Therefore, everyone ultimately comes to a what to them is a self-evident truth based on the quality of their existence, according to the modes of nature. And Krishna says that Shraddhamaya Yang Purusha, the soul, the living being, is constituted of faith. And Jodet Shraddha, whatever that person's faith is, that is what the person is. So you cannot not believe something. If you say, I don't believe anything, then the simple question, do you really believe that you don't believe anything? So it is logically, it's simply impossible for you not to believe something. What you believe will lead you to act intentionally. That is your philosophy, and that becomes the intuitive foundation of your view of the world. And that is influenced by the modes of nature, or determined by the modes of nature. Anyway, there are many more verses in the Gita which are relevant here, I mean, along this same line. But I'll just leave it at that for now, because I want to finish and leave enough time for questions. So there are some common epistemic foundations that practically everyone believes, and they're metaphysical, they're not physical. So in fact, in the real world, excuse me, practically everyone lives in a bi-dimensional universe, physical and metaphysical. No one in their real life lives in a physicalist universe. That's what the atheist John Searle pointed out. And I'll explain what that means. Here's an example of some completely metaphysical beliefs that practically everyone has that can never be empirically demonstrated because they're not physical. For example, other people have minds. Now, we know that we have minds, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And, for example, Brahmatirtha is sitting next to me here, which is very happy to have his company, the director of the BI. So I am very convinced that he has a mind. I can't prove it. I can't empirically prove that he has a mind, and yet I know he does. Or here's another one, which is, in a sense, related. The first example I gave is, in a sense, a subset of the second example, which is that the external world exists. It's Descartes that kind of brought up this possibility, mental possibility of radical skepticism. Like, what if I'm a brain in the laboratory of an evil genius? And there is no external world. There is no Florida. There is no BI. There's nothing. There's just, I'm in the laboratory of an evil genius manipulating my brain. I can't prove that's not true empirically. Here's another one. I can't empirically prove that I have free will. And yet, as even the atheist Searle pointed out, the problem with the doctrine, and determinism requires, by the way, that we have no free will, which logically requires that no one is morally responsible for anything they do. So I'll get into that in a second. But as Searle pointed out, the problem with that physicalist doctrine that we have no free will is that no one can actually live that way. No one can live that way. He gave the example, let's say you go to a restaurant and the waiter's getting impatient. The waiter says, you have to order, and you say, I'm waiting for my neurology to speak. And you can't live that way. If you have children, you have to make decisions or if you want to decide to get married, not to get married, what am I going to do with my life? Should I turn left or right? At every moment, we have to exercise free will. And the idea that we don't have it is simply a mental absurdity, and it's impossible to live a human life based on that idea. So, in fact, we cannot live a responsible human life unless we assume that other people have minds, the external world exists, we have free will. And I already gave the example. You can't prove that you're not dreaming right now. We cannot prove empirically, from the point of view of physicalism, that some actions are right or wrong. If someone goes into school and kills a bunch of children, you can't prove that's wrong. That was David Hume's point. You can't get an ought from an is. You can't get it empirically. You can get it metaphysically, because metaphysically it makes perfect sense to talk about moral principles. It makes no sense at all to talk about them from a physicalist perspective. Or, for example, we talk about human rights, totally metaphysical. But human rights entail human duties, and both are metaphysical. A person who understood this was Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, philosophical term, that we are created equal, endowed by the Creator with rights, because Jefferson was avoiding Hume's challenge that you cannot derive a metaphysical principle from a physical principle. Therefore, the Declaration of Independence, written by very smart people, avoids that philosophical problem by deriving the metaphysical principle of human rights from the metaphysical source of a non-material creator. So I'll start to sum up, leave time for questions. Physicalism is incoherent and hypocritical since practically every physicalist accepts that there really are objective metaphysical items, such as human rights, duties, free will, moral obligations. A physicalist worldview has no room for free will, thus eliminating moral responsibility. Despite, I think, just like hopeless attempts, you find philosophers that they're called compatibilists, that objective moral principles are compatible with a physicalist worldview, and their arguments are pathetic. I mean, I'm embarrassed for them. And these are people that actually hold positions in respectable universities, but their arguments are they're just sort of non-arguments. The person who had the courage to see this, that if you remove God, you can no longer justify moral principles, was Nietzsche. Not my favorite philosopher, but at least he had that integrity to understand that if you remove God from the scene, there's just moral chaos. So another point I want to make is that let's say someone says, prove God. There's a principle in science called experiment design, isn't it? In other words, you design experiments according to what you're looking for. So you don't search for galaxies with microscopes. You don't study microbiology with telescopes. You don't measure molecules with thermometers. So the instrument and method of empirical investigation must be appropriate based on what you presume to be, either what you know or presume to be the nature of that which you're trying to detect, study, or whatever. So again, you would never choose empiricism to study whether or not there's a God. That would be a terrible, irrational, unscientific choice, because in trying to find God or even a soul, we're trying to find higher beings who obviously cannot be detected necessarily by a methodology that depends upon controlling that which you're studying. So therefore, the notion of empiric epistemic hegemony is fundamentally irrational. Then there's something called sensus divinitatis, divine sense or perception, which is attributed to Calvin, not my favorite theologian, but still a good point that actually, and this is also there in our teachings, that we have within us the ability to know God, a divine sense. And so I won't go into that now. I'll just conclude by saying, and then if you have any questions, the prestige of empiric science really rests on its explanatory power and especially on its practical applications. If there are no practical applications, the explanatory power of science would impress a lot fewer people if we didn't have all kinds of machines and technologies and medicine and everything we've got. So analogously, Krishna consciousness gives us extraordinary explanatory power about the metaphysical realm. And the practical application of this philosophy transforms lives very dramatically. So in the historical aftermath of dominant Western religions that seem to cause at least as much harm as good to society, intellectuals went to an opposite extreme called physicalism. And this pendulum swing towards from irrational religion to equally irrational physicalism, equally fanatical. Plato talks about this effect of political opposites leading one to the other, that tyranny leads to anarchy. Galileo talks about it as a pendulum effect. Newton talks about it as his third law of motion. Hegel talks about it as the historical dialectic. So in an age when many reject fanaticism in both its metaphysical and physicalist forms, this historical pendulum is moving back toward the center, giving hope for a reunification of physics and metaphysics, a harmony which existed for thousands of years before the equal and opposite fanaticism of physicalism took over the universities. So by this cooperation for the greatest well-being for human beings and all of nature, what in a sense what the Bhaktivedanta Institute is doing is restoring the unity of knowledge, the equilibrium of physical and metaphysical knowledge, getting away from all kinds of fanaticism. The BI seeks to restore pure science, free from the poison of religious fanaticism, whether it's theistic or atheistic. And so when science is freed from this poison of theistic or atheistic fanaticism, which is not science, we can easily restore the balance between physics and metaphysics, a balance which goes back to the time of Aristotle, even to Plato. So thank you very much. That's my little talk. Now, if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Resnick. There's certainly plenty to think of, and there's been quite a few questions. We may not be able to cover them all. I'm going to start with one that came in close to the end because I think it helps to summarize some of your concerns. And it says, we see fields of medicine, physics, engineering, management in the world around us. Is it that philosophy isn't distinctly seen around and therefore may be considered less relevant to our lives?
Yes. In fact, intellectual historians have noticed that one of the reasons that we're getting this extremist materialism, which is degrading society, is that scientists have lost the habit, which they used to have in the past, especially going back to the 18th, 19th centuries, even the beginning of the 20th century, that scientists were also philosophers. And therefore, they could do their studies, do their empirical work, and then explain what they'd done, not only technically, but in terms of its relevance to humanity, its relevance to human flourishing, and how it interacts with other modes of knowing. So yes, it's a very dangerous and destructive tendency which comes from pride, because if you think you have hegemony, if you think you're the only game in town, then why study philosophy? Because we explain everything. So this is actually a degradation of human scholarship. And so again, we want to restore this balance and bring philosophy back in.
Thank you very much. An early question that we received was why historically the churches were not supporting the early scientists?
Well, they did. Actually, the church was the main patron of the early science. And all of the first great scientists were very religious. I mean, Bacon, who sort of established the scientific method, was a monk, a religious monk. Newton was very religious. They were all Copernicus discovered his heliocentric model inspired in Platonism. Plato's analogy that God is like the sun. So why not God in the center? Why not a heliocentric system? So the turn away from this balance is just due to vanity and pride. And like Prabhupada said, we want to lord it over the world. Science, the empirical method, gives control over nature, and therefore the scientists have been seduced and corrupted by this attachment to power, and they want to sort of, put down any competing ideas. So there's no rational reason. It's all about let's say, the lower nature of human beings has resulted in this fanaticism.
You mentioned the quote from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that Shastra is self-evident. One question was asking, where can they find that quote particularly?
Oh.
Another one asked on the same point, there are many multiple truths, sometimes, differing views, even from the same scriptures. So how can scripture be foundational truth that is commonly agreed on?
Good question. By the way, I just put in chat all the references from Lord Chaitanya.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. That's a very good question. And therefore, what we find in Indian history is that there are debates. Just like if you don't have refereed journals in academia, you're going to get very bad scholarship. And so in an open and free marketplace, so to speak, with debate, non-fanatical debate, the big winner in Indian history was Krishna consciousness. And this is something which even, secular historians say. If you look at the history of Indian religion, you find that there were, furious debates between Buddhists and the Karma Mimamsakas were very important. The Shankara, the Vaishnavas, they were all going at it at a very sophisticated level. I mean, just to take part, you had to have the equivalent of a few PhDs. You had to know everything about logic. You had to know Sanskrit inside and out. You had to know so many things. These are very high level debates. And when all was said and done, the big winner was Krishna consciousness. And even practically today, we find that of all the Indian traditions, whatever the different schools are, it's Krishna consciousness, which actually has global appeal. So ultimately, Tarko Pratishta, you can argue this way and that way, but it really kind of comes out in history. And what history is revealing is the superiority of Krishna consciousness.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there, but we'll be calling you back at the end of this session for the panel, and we'll be able to explore these topics more. Now, we'd hope to show a video at this point, but it is still uploading, unfortunately, and we're going to move shortly to our next speaker. Let me introduce him. This is Riccardo Silvestri, also known as Ramcharitadas. He's a philosophy professor at the Federal University of Campina Grande and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And he's on the line with us now. And thank you very much for tuning in on this one, Riccardo. And I understand the title of your presentation will be Developing a Theistic Theory of Consciousness. Welcome to our
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for organizing this amazing summer school. So I will share my screen now. I have a short presentation. All right. So, okay, my talk will be divided into two parts. The first one, I will very quickly say some few words about my project. That's the title. And in the second part,
sorry to interrupt, but we aren't able to see the presentation mode, actually.
You can't see it?
No, we just see slide number 8 that you have here.
Oh, that's odd, because I started the presentation. Hold on. Okay. I will stop sharing and try to share another screen. Maybe it will. Okay, it should work now. Can you see it now?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, sorry for that. I just shared the wrong screen. Okay, as I said, my presentation will be divided into two parts. The first one, I will say some few words about the project. And in the second one, I will share with you some short reflections based both on the project and on my academic experience. So for the first part, here's the title of the project, Concepts of God and the Variety of Theisms in Indian Traditions. That's the title, but we also have a subtitle, Towards a Theistic Theory of Consciousness. The project is supported by the John Templeton Foundation, which is a very important foundation based on the US. It is hosted by the Brazilian Association for the Philosophy of Religion, and it involves a team of 26 scholars. 13 of them are senior scholars, and the other 13, they are early career researchers. There are people from Brazil, from the US, from the UK, Germany, India, and Australia. As far as the goals are concerned, so we have two general goals The first one is to philosophically reconstruct concepts of God in Indian theistic traditions. And the second one is to investigate the extent to which issues explored by these traditions can somehow contribute to the philosophy of consciousness. So this is how our project relates to consciousness. So about this general goal, because of that, of course, we are dealing also with other traditions, Shaivism, Shaktism, and Jainism. So it's a broad project in this sense. But we also have a narrow goal, which is to address those two general goals with respect to one very specific tradition, which is our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. So in this sense, we are going to deal with the Gita on one sense and with our Chaitanya tradition as represented by Jiva Goswami on the other hand. So the idea here is, I mean, to as I said, to address those two general goals, but with respect to our tradition. So on one hand, we will try to, as I call it, provide philosophical reconstruction of the Gaudiya Vaishnava concept of God. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to see whether our theology can somehow contribute to issues within the contemporary debate on the philosophy of consciousness. And as far as the second goal is concerned, we are going to deal with an ontological theory of consciousness called cosmopsychism, which many people consider to be a kind of panpsychism. The idea is quite simple, I would say. So the first thing about cosmopsychism is that consciousness is fundamental. It can't, for instance, be derived from physical entities, for instance. And the second key idea of cosmopsychism is that the cosmos, understood as the total of reality, is somehow conscious. And this cosmic consciousness ontologically supports or grounds, for instance, our consciousness, what we might call organic consciousness. So because many Indian traditions, they do speak about the cosmos as being conscious, some people find kinds of cosmopsychism inside these traditions. And as far as our tradition is concerned, of course, God is seen as the totality of reality. This is found in several texts, for instance, in the Gita itself. So in our case, the cosmos, again, understood as the totality of consciousness, the totality of reality, is conscious, and this cosmic consciousness grounds our consciousness. So this is an alternative way to explain human consciousness and animal consciousness, but at this time, without relying on like the features of micro entities, which are supposed to be physical. Okay, as far as the results of our project are concerned, so we had our first conference in Oxford 2 months ago. We are going to have 2 more conferences, one here in Brazil, in João Pessoa, in February 2025, and the third one in Rishikesh, India, in April. So for the publications, we are going to have 2 volumes, one handbook on concepts of God in Indian traditions, which will be published probably by Oxford University Press. And a second one, the title is Concepts of God in the Variety of Theisms in Indian Traditions, which is the title of our project, which will be published by Springer, 2025. We are going to also have 2 journal special issues, one of them dealing with concepts of God in underrepresented religious traditions, and the second one dealing specifically about consciousness. The title will probably be God and Consciousness in Indian Traditions, Analytical Perspectives. We don't know the journal yet, but it will be a top journal, a philosophical top journal. And we also are going to have 5 papers. Okay, we plan to write and publish 5 papers. Well, the first one was already published It's a paper authored by me. The title is Panentheism and Theistic Cosmopsychism, God and the Cosmos in the Gita. So here I try to analyze the kind of cosmopsychism we find in the Gita. And it was just published in Sophia, which is a known philosophy journal. And there's a second one which is ready, but wasn't published yet. In this paper, I deal with the concept of Achintya Bheda Bheda in Jiva, and analyze try to analyze the kind of contradiction or paradox that is found in Jiva's Achintya Bheda Bheda Vedanta. And that's it. So as far as the project is concerned, that's all I had to say. Of course, I didn't want to speak a lot about the project itself, so my purpose was just to give you a very brief idea of what the concept is. We have still 2 more years, so the project ends in 2026. And all these results and the conference and the papers and the publications, they will be done in this period. All right, so now for the second part, sorry, as I said, based on the project itself and also based on my experience. I have been around in academia for 20 years. And so I'd like to share with you some reflections about those 4 questions, which is quite relevant to us and also to this school, I suppose. So the first one is how can we be relevant? The first one, how to be intellectually respected, how to present our worldview, and how to show that we have the best worldview. So I assume these are key questions. So some things need to be said about this question. The first one is, what do we mean by our theology? Usually you use the expression philosophy, right? I don't want to use it here for several reasons. Perhaps I can talk about that in the end. So, but our worldview or our theology, so how to approach, how to understand that. So I think there are at least 2 options here, or 2 approaches. The first one is to focus on issues which are shared with other Indian traditions or with other theistic traditions. For instance, reincarnation and karmas and the fact that we believe that there exists a soul. So these are, of course, key aspects of our tradition, but they're not exclusive to our tradition. So the second approach is to focus on issues exclusive to our Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And here we have, of course, the nature of God, the Achintya Bheda Bheda doctrine, and so many other issues. A second important thing is, it seems that we have a kind of standard answer to these questions. If you want, for instance, to be intellectually respected, for instance, we have just to use the proper language and address the right and relevant issues, showing, for instance, that Gaudiya Vaishnavism offers a good solution to them. But then there is something else that needs to be said, is that all those questions, they presuppose a to by whom question. When you ask the question how to be relevant, so for whom we want to be relevant, how to present our worldview, to whom we want to present this worldview, by whom we want to be intellectually respected. So these things, they should be taken, of course, into consideration. For instance, if you want to be respected by scholars, we have to use their language, we have to address the issues that they think are relevant. And the same if you want to approach like a broader intellectually informed public. But even here, there are qualifications. For instance, if you say that we want to be respected by scholars, but what kind of scholars? Scientists or philosophers and theologians? And if you say scientists, so what kind of scientists? Are we speaking about biologists and anthropologists? What kind of scholars? So this is important because each one of those class of people have their own language. and they have their own set of relevant issues. And the same, I suppose, for like a broader intellectually informed public. So if we want to answer those questions, I think we should first try to find our public, our audience. And after that, then we should try to use their language. And this is a kind of fuzzy statement, but it means that we should somehow, in a sense, translate our ideas in such a way that they are understood by this public. And second, that our ideas somehow, we can show that our ideas are somehow relevant to the issues that those people are concerned with. But I would like to present a kind of unified answer, in a sense, because of course we have different groups of people, we have different languages, different issues, and so on and so forth. However, I claim that to some extent philosophy is essential in addressing all those questions, regardless of the answer that we give to the two by whom questions. That's because it seems to me that it makes some sense to say that engaging with any intellectually informed group necessitates a clear and detailed articulation of our worldview, and one that carefully considers some philosophical issues, some fundamental philosophical issues. The saying that I can mention here is the devil is in the details. So unless we have a relatively detailed account of our theology, of our worldview, we won't be able to translate it into like the language of a specific group. Neither will be able to address properly the issues that interest this group. And in order to justify this claim, I can mention just some basic, well-known facts about philosophy. And I should say that I'm using the word philosophy here in academic sense. I mean, when I speak about philosophy, I'm speaking about professional philosophy or academic philosophy, which is not that distinct from like the Greek philosophy or the scholastic philosophy, although there are so many different conceptions of philosophy. I mean, the question what philosophy is one of the questions that philosophers try to answer. That's funny, to say the least. But anyway, despite the diversity of conceptions of what philosophy is, I think there is something that remains throughout there's a kind of hardcore. And if this hardcore is considered, I think these 4 points are true. First, that philosophy helps in the precise definition and clarification of different concepts, specifically theological concepts, because we shouldn't forget that our worldview is a theological worldview. I mean, we can't like separate God or the soul and the relationship between ourselves and God. We can take this out of our worldview. So our worldview is a theological worldview. So philosophy can be very helpful, for instance, in clarifying theological concepts. What our concept of God means, what we mean when we say that, for instance, God has several extensions. Second, philosophy, both philosophy and theology deal with fundamental questions about existence, purpose, and the nature of reality. So philosophy in this sense might provide tools and methods for exploring these questions in a theological context. Third, philosophy can help address and resolve apparent contradictions and paradoxes within theological doctrines. There are not few, there are a lot of paradoxes within many theological traditions, including our tradition. Fourth, philosophy adds in the defense of religious beliefs. So how to convince someone that our specific religious belief is rational? Which arguments can you give to support this claim? So philosophy definitely can help in this regard. And here are just some few examples of how philosophy can help in understanding better our tradition. And again, the fact, this is important for those 4 initial questions, because unless we have a detailed account of our theology, of our worldview, we won't be able to translate our worldview in a satisfactory way to those people, even to like, I would say, intellectually well-informed people. We have to have like a detailed description of our theology, even though it's not that detailed description that we present to them. We need it in order to filter, we take a good look at our reconstructed theology, and we pick the elements that we think are relevant to this specific public. Anyway, just some few examples here, about the nature of God. First, what's the ontological status of Krishna's expansions? Are they identical to Krishna in the sense of being the same entity? So this is a key question, I would say. The second one, Krishna is supposed to possess contradictory qualities, such as being both immanent and transcendent. How can then such contradictions coexist within a coherent theological framework? Third, what cognitive functions are inherent to the soul? Of course, these three questions pertain to the nature of reality, so to speak. So, what cognitive functions are inherent to the soul? Does thought qualify as one? If so, why do we possess a material mind, like Mana's mind and Buddhic intelligence? So these are philosophical questions. Some questions to which I would say we don't have like a consensual answer and neither a detailed answer. I'm almost done, a candidate, just one more minute. Okay, thanks. Other questions. Is our worldview dualist or monist? In what precise sense are we different and non-different from God? That has to do with our Beda Beda doctrine, of course. Is a Achintya Beda Beda a contradiction? That's a very important question. Some Hare Krishnas would say yes, some would say no. Anyway, but if we say yes, how this affects the rationality of our theology? What sense of inconceivability should we attach to the word achintya? And of course, there are other questions, epistemological questions, how to justify that Shabda and superior to empirical inferential knowledge, question about free will and divine foreknowledge, and also questions about interreligious discourse. And I hope I was clear enough. Sorry if I spoke too much. Thank you so much. Candidate.
Oh, thank you very much, Ricardo. Ramcharidadas. That was just excellent. Thank you for finishing. We've got time for a couple of questions, or at least one, I think might be more complex question. There's obviously very big differences between the concepts of God as provided within the Eastern context, and particularly within the Indian knowledge systems, and Western ideas. And from the questions you were posing yourselves, there's a lot more complexity to the concepts. Do you feel that this is a challenge in actually conveying the applicability of Eastern theology to perhaps how the rest of the world might conceive of God?
Applicability? Yes, I believe there is applicability, and one of our goals, one of the goals of our project is to show that there is at least one applicability in terms of dealing with the problem of consciousness. But again, if we speak about applicability, everything depends on the kind of problem that we're trying to address, right? For some issues, no applicability. Other issues, we might have some applicability. And you mentioned Western concepts of God, but I confess that I wasn't able to really grasp your question. Of course, there are differences between our concepts, Indian concepts of God, and in particular our concept of God and Western concepts of God, of course, but there are similarities too. And this is a work that has to do with comparative philosophy, to compare those different concepts of God. Yeah, but this is a whole project.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, but we'll be also inviting you for our panel a little later.
Thanks so much.
It may be that some of our members who have logged on expecting the Bhaktivedanta Institute to be more science-oriented, it may be surprised that we are covering so much on philosophy. But I think that what this session is meant to highlight is that science works on a certain, its own methodology of empiricism, and therefore has limited its scope to what it can deal with through that methodology for ascertaining things that we can be confident in. But it is philosophy which tells us the significance of our observations and the purposes by which we might put our technologies and our understanding of how the world works. So that's why we're focusing so seriously on this, because philosophy of science, how science is guided by sound logic and philosophical reasoning, is absolutely crucial to getting the benefits that that humanity can enjoy from the scientific world. So now I'm going to play a little video. This video is a lecture given by Ravi Gupta, also known as Radhika Ramandas, at the Bhaktivedanta Institute's Consciousness in Science conference that we held in Gainesville in 2019. Radhika Raman holds the Charles Redd Chair of Religious Studies and serves as a professor and head of the Department of History at Utah State University. And I hope that you'll enjoy this particular video, which looks at the question, can empirical observation influence scriptural testimony? And what happens when what we observe seems to be different to what we might read in Shastra? And this is an exploration through Jiva Goswami's works. So if I just take a moment to share the video.
So, good evening, everyone. I have the distinction of being the last speaker today and of being the only person between you and dinner. So, I'm going to try my best to keep this short. I don't have a PowerPoint. It's rather old-fashioned. I have a handout, but I grossly underestimated the number of people who would come to the conference. And so I'll pass this back. If we can just have 2 handouts per row, I think we'll get through the whole thing. Unless your row has 2 people, then please use 1. This is not a summary of my talk. It's quotations that I use in my talk, but you do not need to follow along in order to understand, so please don't worry if you can't see a handout. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Bob Cohen and to Dr. Jonathan Banks and to Prishni Sutton for inviting me and for arranging the logistics of the trip. I'm really grateful. I'm here really, I mean, I know many people have said this, but I'm truly here as an outsider because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a historian of science, I'm not a philosopher of science. I come to this meeting from the perspective of theology and religious studies, which is what I teach professionally. And so although I'm not coming at it from the perspective of science, if we conceive of part of our work here as a meeting between science and religion, between spirituality and science, then I think it's important that we look at the subject matter from the perspective of theology as well. So many of our speakers, most of them, have been talking about, well, if we're standing in the realm of science, how do we reach out to spirituality? How do we reach out to religion? My approach is going to be from the opposite direction. Standing in the realm of theology, particularly Chaitanya Vaishnava or Gaudiya Vaishnava theology, the tradition within which Bhaktivedanta Institute is grounded, how do we find space? How do we create space for scientific reflection, empirical observation? So the title of my talk is really a question. Does empirical observation, is there room for empirical observation to influence scriptural testimony? And for those who are familiar with the terminology, the question I'm really asking is a question of pramana. What are the valid means of knowledge that we can get? And the philosophers of the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, particularly Jiva Goswami, the main systematic philosopher of the early tradition in the 16th century, boils down the number of pramanas, or valid sources of knowledge, to 3. Shabda, scriptural testimony; pratyaksha, empirical observation or sensory observation; and anumana, which is logical inference. Sometimes reason, but I think inference is technically more correct. So these 3 are described as valid means of knowing things in this world and beyond this world. But as will be familiar to those who know this tradition, Shabda, or revelation, scriptural testimony, I won't get hung up on specific translations here. We can discuss them more individually, but scriptural testimony or revelation is regarded as the one that is really the controlling pramana, so that in his Sarva Samvadani, his appendix to the Sandarbhas, Jiva Goswami says that this one means of Shabda is superior in that it does not depend on any of the others, pratyaksha or anumana, that although the others may assist it as far as they are able, this one independent means of knowing in performing its function is even seen to overrule the others. That a fact established by the one means, Shabda, is irreversible by the others. And finally, that it is most effective in proving facts that the powers of the other means cannot even touch. In sum, later on he says, the 2 other principal means of knowing, inference or reason and perception, are thus reduced to shadow-like subordinates. This essentially is our problem. Okay, this is not the problem, but the challenge. If Shabda has such an overwhelming rule and control over the other 2, then the use of scientific inquiry, if science is along the lines of what Dr. Banks defined it as today, the use of scientific inquiry can at best be merely to confirm what is written in Scripture, which then makes it perhaps a tool for adding conviction or understanding or marketing, but not too much more. It's not a means of gaining new knowledge. This is the challenge. But what I've just presented as the notion of Shabda from those 2 quotations is actually just one part of the picture. And in fact, if we look at Jiva Goswami's notion of scriptural testimony, it's far more complex than what I just said it was. It's nuanced, and in fact, we see that there are numerous chinks in the armor of Shabda. He himself creates a space for empirical observation and inference to affect how we know the world. He considers them real pramanas, not merely supportive. So I've got 6 places, 6 chinks in the armor, 6 locations where space is created by Jiva, looking at his work on the Sarvasamvadini. And I just want to run through them really quickly. And if any of you are interested in any one of those spaces, please feel free to talk to me afterwards or ask a question. I'll be happy to discuss further. But I won't dwell on them for too long, given our time limit here. So the first question that rises right away in any thinking person's mind is to ask, well, what constitutes Shabda? What can we put in the category of scriptural revelation? And the obvious candidate is there, first and foremost. It's the Vedas, okay, these sources of eternal knowledge and wisdom. But then what's very interesting is just in the next paragraph, Jiva Goswami says, but besides the Vedas, we should also include other authoritative works such as medical texts, Vaidya Shastra. And then he raises an objection from someone on the conservative Shabda side, saying, one may argue that they, medical texts, are unsanctioned like other works because there is no evidence to prove their authority. But we say no, we can accept these additional texts as scripture because they faithfully follow the Vedas. Now, I find it really interesting that of all the different types of reliable knowledge that he could use, he chose medical texts. Because that is one area of knowledge that from the beginning of human history we know is very susceptible to change and observation. Right? He didn't use astrology, he didn't use metallurgy, he didn't use any number of sciences that would have been current in his time. He used medical texts where observation, input, experimentation, and growth of knowledge over time would have been very common, even in his day, in the 16th century. So the question I want to raise, and again we won't discuss this further, is if Shabda is knowledge from a trusted source, which is how he defines it, then in some way, perhaps not on the level of Veda, but in some way can reliable scientific knowledge be placed in the category, the second tier of Shabda, of trusted knowledge from a non-divine or indirect divine origin, rather than the direct origin of the Vedas. Point number 2, the second question or chink in the armor, is quoting from approvingly from the great Advaitin, impersonalist commentator Vachaspati Mishra. Jiva affirms that scriptural evidence does not negate the authority of sensory perception in ordinary worldly matters. If it did, then we would have no way of accessing scripture at all, since we rely on our senses to hear and understand scripture accurately. So he says it doesn't deny the authority of sensory observation in ordinary matters, but only in special cases. And how does he define ordinary matters? He says pratyaksha, sensory observation, has authority everywhere and anywhere, except in certain special cases when scripture imposes itself on the physical world and decides to contradict. Okay, and what those special cases are when scripture does impose itself, you'll have to talk to me individually to find out. Since I'm down to 5 minutes, point number 3 is that he says scripture can impose itself in these special cases on sensory observation, but its primary domain, he says, is on those things not available to sensory observation. And he gives specific kinds of examples to show that when things cannot possibly be falsified by science because they are in a realm beyond scientific observation or physical observation, he says that's the primary domain of scripture. It's not the only domain. It does impinge on the physical world, but it is the primary domain where we ought to be using scripture. And again, this is this is, I think, very significant. In fact, he, like other Vedantists, defined this world as ashabdam. The physical world is that realm which is not known only through shabda. Therefore, it's called ashabda. Point number 4, Scripture is eternal and divine with no human author, but it is revealed to us through human sages. And so this creates a hermeneutical circle. Essentially, how do we get shabda? It's through pratyaksha, through the observation of those who are trusted. What is their observation? That's what produces shabda. So if you see what I mean, we have this hermeneutical circle, and in hermeneutics, circles are very valuable. That's how hermeneutics happens, is through these circles. So it's not circular thinking we're talking about here. We're talking about an interpretive circle, which is very useful. And then point number 5, how do we know that claims of scriptural descent are true, of divine descent of Scripture? Well, because it's coming from a trusted source. But how do we know that source is trusted? And in order to get out of circularity there, he says it's because we know that Shabda can be trusted because it's self-evident. Again, it's self-evident to human apprehension. And he gives this wonderful story of you are the 10th person. If you know this story, you'll know what I mean here. If you don't know it, come talk to me and I'll tell you the story. And then finally, point number 6, is that even when Scripture does impinge on the physical world, how do we understand it? How do we understand that contradiction, if there is a contradiction? And this goes into this wonderful area of interpretation. There's Sanskrit literature is very detailed in its ability of interpretive criticism. And there's direct and indirect meanings of Scripture. Direct meanings are always preferred, but indirect meanings, sometimes non-literal meanings, can be used in particular circumstances. Those circumstances, one of them is when the direct meaning is implausible because it does not match with our observation of the world. Okay? And the famous example is the village on the Ganges. The text says the village is on the Ganges. The idea of human habitation in the middle of a river is unlikely to our experience. Therefore, we add an interpretive element there to say that the village is on the banks of the Ganges, taking an indirect interpretation. He does one more, which is really cool. One of the statements of the Vedas is that the stones float. Okay? And he says the idea that stones float doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us in direct observation, but this statement is made by the Vedas in order to increase the ritual power of the stones within the Vedic sacrifice. So in religious studies terms, he's essentially giving a functionalist explanation for the idea that, for a scriptural statement, that the statement itself is true, but it's true because of its function, rather than its ontological claim that stones are floating. Just in case you're wondering, he does give the example of the bridge of Lord Rama as an example of stones floating. But he says that's not a general situation or experience in life. In general, this is used to increase the ritual potency of stones. Okay, so these are my 6 points. I just want to say that the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition is one that distinguishes itself from impersonalism with the idea, the conviction that we live in a real world, right? That the world is real. Let us not eviscerate that commitment to the reality of the world by completely stifling the space for pratyaksha, for genuine engagement with the world. Why is the world real? Jiva Goswami says the most important reason is that it is available to our senses. And I think that's the space, that's the primary space we have for engagement, for taking seriously empirical observation as a source for valid knowledge. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Radhika Raman. We move on now to our next speaker. This is Stuart Grides. This is Stita D. Mooney, who is a PhD in the history of science and teaches at various colleges and universities across Gainesville. He's a co-director for the Richard Thompson Archives, and of course they were responsible for bringing back all of Satiputha's manuscripts and previous publications back into print and available as part of the resources of the BI. He also assists in the BIHS, and he's been with it since its conception 7 years ago. So today we've invited him to speak on a publication that he and helped to arrange and bring together with a number of other inputs. And this is a study of resolving the Siddhantic and Puranic universes. I'm now going to hand over to Stita D. Mooney, and I hope you will enjoy this presentation.
Can you hear me all? I can't hear you guys, so I'm going to kind of just go with it.
We can hear you. Thank you very much. We're ready to go.
All right, and you can see the screen. Okay, resolving the Siddhantic and Puranic. Thank you very much, Akanadi Prabhu, and of course Kunal and Brahmatirtha, and naturally all the organizers, and especially Hirdan Maharaj for being such an enthusiastic patron of the BIHS here. Okay, resolving the Siddhantic and Puranic universes was the title suggested for this program, this talk, and it's really focusing on this text here. This was you can get it online now. Actually, it's free today for everybody who is attending this conference. You can scan me. Just scan that. It'll take you right to the Amazon page, or otherwise type in Vedic cosmology for modern context, Bhaktivedanta Institute, take you to that page. And you can certainly read the front matter, table of contents, intro, so on. But today you can read the whole thing, and perhaps you can even download it. So that was, oopsie daisy, that was an early edition of it, the manuscript. And I'm clicking here. Okay, and a couple, while you're on Amazon, there's a couple other books you might want to check out. These are journals, compilations of various presentations at BIHS events. Nice. Purvapaksha is another term referring to this ancient tradition of disciplined discourse within the context of the Sanskrit culture of South of Asia, of the Indian subcontinent. We have 2 volumes out. Something to check out. Let me try this button. Oh, here we go. And lo and behold, we put these up for availability on Amazon there, and they were #1. I don't know how that's possible, but Krishna is amazing. He can thread an elephant through the eye of a needle, I've been told. But apparently there's an audience out there for this thing. There's also some front matter there you can check out explaining the scope of the project. So let's get into our book. So this will be the print edition. We're working on the print edition. What's on Amazon now is the Kindle edition, the ebook. And we're still, that's the book, but we're still tightening it up, proofreading and, layout, design, and so forth. But so this, the print edition is coming out soon. Here's the cover. We have proof copies, if you can see me. That's one of the copies. We're going through it. We may come out in both color and black and white. Back it up, please. All right. So Vedic cosmography in a modern context. The title is in part a deference to Satiputha and his work, Vedic cosmography and astronomy. And hold on, my clock. Here we go. My timer is off on my covered up by Zoom. All right, Vedic cosmography and astronomy. Actually, Tamarpani, when he read a review manuscript, he mentioned that. It seemed like it was a continuation of that body of analysis. So we're talking about this cosmography. Again, we're using the term Vedic to refer to that Sanskrit culture of the Indian subcontinent. And we're bringing it into a modern context. What's the discussion now? Now, the term Varota Parihara revisited in the sub heading here. That's a Sanskrit term referring to this long discussion. The idea that the observable, mathematically quantified, whatever's up there in the night sky and day sky, that doesn't seem to correspond cleanly with the descriptions in the Puranas. And some of the leading figures in the history of astronomy and mathematics come out of the South Asian context. So they were well aware that there was this dynamic tension between the empirical view and the Shastric presentation in the Puranas. And they had a long discussion of this going back thousands of years. So we're revisiting this discussion. There's nothing new here under the sun, or the night sky either, for that matter. And so we're revisiting this ancient tradition of discourse. It's not modern science and the Puranas. It's not modern science and ancient cosmology. The actual discussion about the dynamic tension, the apparent tension between observable astronomy and the Puranic narrative is as ancient as the culture itself. It's certainly from a historical context. And both observable astronomy is integral to this, using the term Vedic culture. They were doing birth charts. They're doing religious rituals, need exact times and dates. It's all done through astronomy. Agriculture, administrative duties all need calendars. This is all astronomy and mathematics. Krishna had his birth chart done by Gargamuni, according to the scriptural renditions. And Lord Chaitanya's grandfather, maternal grandfather, was a Jyotisha. He was a Sanskrit mathematical astronomer. And not only that, but our Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj was also a highly recognized as an expert Jyotisha Sanskrit mathematical astronomer, as well as our rendition of the fifth canto, translated to English by, our Prabhupada here, he primarily based it on Bhaktisiddhanta's Bengali translation. So these two traditions are entwined intimately throughout this cultural context that we're visiting. And we got some nice reviews here. We sent it out for extensive reviewing by various ISKCON scholars. Some of them are on the back here. We'll look at that in a second. All right, just a quick point on this Varota Parihara. The term means removal of incompatibility and reconciliation, from Monia Williams. There's a couple authors here. Suryadas, from the time of Lord Chaitanya, did a study of this in a chapter of his book here. And the Sanskrit title of this chapter is Jyotisha Shastra Purana Varota Parihara, which translates, removing the contradiction between observable astronomy, Jyotisha Shastra, and the Puranic narrative. There's another example. Got to stop touching the mouse. Kevalaram Jyotishara. He was the chief astronomer for Maharaj Jai Singh, who did a lot of astronomy. And he was a great patron of the Vaishnava religion and tradition, as well as science here, as we'll see in a second. And his title of his entire book was Bhagavat Jyotisha Shor Bhugola Varota Parihara, removal of the disagreement between the Bhagavat Purana and observable astronomy concerning the sphere of the earth. So again, the point taken here is these issues were well known throughout the tradition. We have texts going back to, full texts going back to Aryabhata, late antiquity, and these texts are referring back to an even more ancient tradition, so on. Okay, so Kevalaram, he was working for Jai Singh, great patron of Vaishnav culture and the sciences, and Jai Singh built a number of observable naked eye, because they had the telescope, but it wasn't widely distributed in India. A flip cart wasn't carrying it at the time. And so they did naked eye observatories to make it more facilitating, did it all over India. Here's a few images of a few on the map. One was in Mathura. That's the only one no longer extant, but Delhi and Jaipur were the most sophisticated ones. Here's a picture of the one in Delhi. It's still there. And some of this instrumentation was cutting edge at the time. All right, what do we got here? So we had a few, and again, this Vaishnavism is really entwined in all this. The dynamic tension between observable astronomy and the Puranic narrative. Here's a few of the reviews here from our people. Krishna Kshetra Maharaj here, Kenneth Valpy. I thought he did the forward as well. So I thought he really got a good grasp on what the scope of the project is. We're not trying to find this definitive resolution or harmonization of this long discussion. We're not trying to find 6 sound bites, plaster it on wherever it gets plastered, and everybody march to that. We're trying to bring up the complexity, the maturity of this narrative, and bring it to our context in time. Rather, it aims to bring together these varied accounts, the Sanskrit commentarial exegesis, and so on and so forth between these traditions within the broader Vedic experience. And what emerges from this assembly of resources is a highly valuable knowledge base for anyone who intends to seriously delve further into the subject. So I thought that kind of nailed it, what we're aiming for. Better I can say myself. Another review we got from Edward Bryant, known to us more as Advaita Prabhu, Department of Religion at Rutgers. And he's talking about how this Purva Paksha, this debate, this disciplined tradition of debate has gone on for thousands of years, between observable, between the esoteric, the exoteric. Somehow the Puranas are still here, even though it's very difficult, perhaps, to see how it relates to mathematical astronomy. So since this has been going on for thousands of years, modern cosmological Purva-pakshas or modern cosmological views are just another episode in the Bhagavatam's long journey through space and time. And a volume like this indicates that the essential teachings can never be threatened by these space-time tattvas, even though we may engage, even when we engage with integrity and robustness into these discussions, into the debate. Our HDG, our Hridaya Maharaj, also reviewed this book on a few occasions. He came back with a very encouraging response. He felt it was a valuable approach, make a valuable contribution. Got some nice reviews from many others, too many to mention here. I have a couple more here, Radha Mohan and Krishna Dharma. All right, so what's in the book? This is go check it out on Amazon, get the full thing available today. And any day, the front matter is available. And of course, for $5, you can download it. And soon the print edition will be available. All right, so Guru Sadhana Shastra, the first section, we go through it at length. Prabhupada, the Acharyas in our tradition, various sadhus identified with, this is a more internal view, a Vaishnava view, Shastric accounts. Then section 2, we look at the broader culture of the tradition, Puranic accounts, and Jyotisha, this observable Sanskrit mathematical astronomy accounts, both integral to the tradition, and how they engaged and discoursed between the two for thousands of years that we have record of. And then we look at contemporary discussions, both East and West, natural science in the modern world, how they formulate their arguments, also contemporary analysis and reviews and commentaries, more recent commentaries on Puranic perspectives and the discourse between the two. And then the other half of the book is a bunch of essays, independent essays and appendices. We have a wonderful essay from Burijan giving an overview of the fifth canto. We have an excerpt from Sadhaputta Prabhu, a narration on the describing the description of the Bhumandala plane in the Puranas. We have a comprehensive collection of statements from Prabhupada on this topic. We have a little bit of an analysis here of this a very highly respected Vaishnav Sanskrit commentator on the Bhagavatam. Prabhupada refers to him, mentions him, and Sadhaputta did an analysis of him. When we go at length into some of his analysis in the fifth canto, it's very intriguing. Not that he's right, whatever that may mean in this topic, but that just some of the sophistication and maturity that's brought to bear on this subject. We did a person who did a little historical analysis of historical maps of the Earth. And again, we kind of focused on the Earth a little bit since we're most familiar with that. We live on this, it seems to be right underneath our feet here. So she did an analysis with beautiful maps from history, from print, and so on, of way the views of the Earth and the cosmos have been looked at. We have a few more essays in here from some second generation folks and their experience dealing with these issues. Namamrita Green, Yogeshwar's son, Brian Green's nephew, a very famed celebrity scientist. He was an airline pilot looking at the Earth from that angle. And Prahlad Griffith here, Jamastami's son. These guys are middle-aged and boring now. They used to be young and happening, but we got them before they got too old and boring. Prahlad Griffith did an experiment That's a classic experiment referred to it by Aristotle, also in the Middle Ages by Sacrobosco. These are discussed in the book, that basically if you're over an open body of water and it's far enough away, and he had one side of a lake in the Akal National Forest at night, and the other side of the lake, they had someone on a ladder, and they had a light up at the top of the ladder and a light on the surface, on the bottom of the ladder. And because of the curvature of the earth, is the argument, it's like looking over a hill. You can only see one of the two lights. The one at the bottom, you can't see because it's behind the curve, and the one on the top you can see. So again, we're talking about empiricism and Shastra and different descriptions, and we're engaging it all. And then we also have a section on BBT books while Prabhupada was present, supervising the production and all kinds of spheres and planets and Saturn with rings. And there's even all the kinds of print illustrations in Prabhupada's books. Also, there's actually an image of the lunar module on the cover of one of the early books that was used on the inside in later editions of Easy Journey. All right, so how did Prabhupada handle this these issues with concern to Bhaktivedanta Institute? Here's a letter to Madhavadas at the time, now Bhakti Madhava Puri. He's one of the founders of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, along with Swarup Damodar and Sariputta and R. Brahma Tirtha and others. This is in 1976, and I'm sure he was asking Prabhupada, it seems from this quote, you can get this whole letter online at Vanipedia and so forth, but I'm sure he's asking Prabhupada what to do about the fifth canto and modern science. And my God, I'm going bald, I'm scratching my head over this. Or maybe he didn't say that, but I can certainly relate if he did. But so Prabhupada's responding, well, after all, we are all just insignificant creatures in this universe. And who can say, we're very tiny. Little insects on the universal body. So whether you take modern scientists or Sukadeva Goswami, it is still all just, there's a lot going on out there. Inconceivable. It is best, whatever the case may be, it is best to keep faith in Sukadeva Goswami, because actually our only business is to go back home, back to Godhead. Something to keep in mind. It's not like when you go back to the spiritual world, they give you an entrance exam about the cosmos in the conditional realm. Or maybe they do, but I suspect they don't. So Prabhupada here is saying, so whether Sukadeva Goswami or the modern scientists are right or wrong, it is nothing interesting to us. It's not the essential point to us. Our essential point is we want to go back home, back to Godhead. And then he quotes the Bhagavad Gita, and those who worship me will live with me. So, talking about what's really driving us as Vaishnavas when we engage with this and other topics, this is the central point, we're here to engage everything in Krishna's service. This all belongs to Krishna. All right, so you got to be careful when talking about these things, I think. A little humility. And this is from Murli Gopal, got us this little cartoon here. So it's an illustration, a couple of fleas in their little forest of material enjoyment here, and they're thinking they're on a dog, and they're arguing, is it round, is it flat? Looks like they're getting ready to get in a fight over it here. They got their paws up there, or whatever those little things are. And it's round, it's flat, it's round, it's flat. And as it turns out, and how could they know? They're on a cat, they're on a dog, and it's not round or flat, but they're convinced it's got to be one or the other. So who knows what all the variables are? This is an interesting topic. It's meant to be engaged, and it's an invitation to go further into the subject. I'll end it here. Another thing to keep a little bit of humility as you enter this subject, we talk about how to reconcile it. Well, perhaps a little humility is desirable here. This is how Sukadeva Goswami introduces the whole subject. And again, this is all in that book. Go get it today. Sukadeva Goswami introduces the subject of Purana cosmology. He's responding to, this is in the 16th chapter where the subject's brought up, responding to Parikshit Maharaj's questions. Please speak about this because it'll purify the mind. Sukadeva Goswami says, my dear king, you got to remember, there is no limit to the expansions of the Supreme Personality of God. There's no limit to the material energy, his material energy. No one could possibly explain it perfectly, even in a lifetime as long as that of Brahma. However you approach it. And then in the purport, Prabhupada says, the limits of the expansions of Govinda cannot be estimated by anyone. So, what are you going to do? It's interesting. Let's examine it. But so at the end of the day, just be satisfied with the information obtainable from Vedic sources as spoken by Sukadeva Goswami, these other great sages. There's something there to plumb. What it may be, it's part of the adventure. Many books have been written on this. I highly also recommend Sariputa's Vedic cosmography. Of course, Mysteries is very intriguing. Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. All right, so he's just telling us just be satisfied, enjoy the trip. He's not telling us to get a lobotomy. You know, he's not telling us to get 6 marching points and forget the rest. Hear what you want to hear and disregard the rest. He's saying just be satisfied with this, enter into this, and enjoy the ride. So with that, to infinity and beyond. So I think I'll end it there. I lost track of my time. Hopefully I'm reasonably on schedule here. How are we doing?
Very much. Actually, you're dead on time, which
Okay.
there's lots of cheers going around. I was to congratulate you on that. Thank
Well,
you.
being on time
Unfortunately-
is my mission at the BIHS.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into further discussion, but I think it's extremely important what you pointed out, that the issue of resolving our understanding of the Puranic description of the universe isn't something that is a discussion between ourselves and modern science, but rather there is an ancient discussion on resolving the world of our experience with the reality that may be the actuality of the cosmos. So thank you very much for presenting that. We will move on now to our next speaker. Oh, I've just lost my... Oh, I will mention one thing. Stita Deepa, I tried to scan that QR code, and although it took me to Amazon, it didn't show me the publication. So maybe that's something to look into and make sure that
That's an old code, maybe it expired. But type in the title, Vedic Cosmography in a Modern Context, and Bhaktivedanta Institute. It should bring you there. The whole book is available for today and any day. And of course, there'll be more coming in when we get the print edition, and we'll let everybody know. Sorry about that. It was a code we put together. Maybe it expired earlier.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Still there.
Next, I'd like to introduce His Holiness Bhaktivedanta Goswami, also known as Dr. Vadim Turnev, who holds a PhD and is director of the Bhaktivedanta Institute in Russia. And today he's going to be presenting on 2 ways of presenting Krishna consciousness, which are as the science of God or as a religion, and differences in the approaches and consequences of each of those methodologies. So I'll now pass you over and welcome Bhaktivedanta Goswami. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akandadi Prabhu. I'm very happy to be a part of this summer school of Bhaktivedanta Institute, and I'm somewhat embarrassed after hearing all these lofty presentations, especially the one from Hridayananda Maharaj. So my presentation will be of more practical nature. Still, I hope it will be relevant for the participants of this school. Basically, the reason why I'm presenting this is that I see the alarming tendency of presenting Krishna consciousness more and more as a religion. We are claiming to be a bona fide religion, and in a zeal to prove this claim, we are kind of betraying the initial premise or foundation upon which Srila Prabhupada found his Krishna consciousness movement. So I'll make some observations which are there about the tendencies, and the main point of this presentation is to show the very dangerous consequences of stressing the religious nature of Krishna consciousness as opposed to the scientific nature of Krishna consciousness as Prabhupada was claiming. So I'm doing this in connection with the core mission of BI, and let's see how it works. So Srila Prabhupada said to Satsvarup Maharaj, the next phase is yours. You must establish our movement as a genuine scientific movement. And of course, we all know that Srila Prabhupada again and again and again was stressing this point that Krishna consciousness is scientific by nature. And he says the same thing in the letter to Amarendra Prabhu, that this party is our most important preaching arm, which we will be able to destroy the bogus speculation and cheating which goes under the banner of scientific advancement. So he wanted us to present Krishna consciousness as he did, not as a dogma, not as a religious belief, but as a rational science. And basically, if we take any scientific theory, it must be non-dogmatic, rational, and its conclusions should logically follow from several fundamental premises, as Hridayananda Maharaj so beautifully explained, that there should be some axiomatic truths behind any scientific theory, and it has to be able to explain the maximum number of observed phenomena. It should be universally applicable, and Srila Prabhupada, of course, gloriously proved that Krishna consciousness is universally applicable indeed. So it's not some ethnic kind of belief. It should work anytime, anywhere, and it should be experimentally verifiable or falsifiable. So, if we take Krishna consciousness and analyze from these 4 points, we will see that it fits the bill, it fits all the criteria, and Srila Prabhupada specifically stressed that it should be practically applicable and should make the practical changes and should work practically, basically. This is a beautiful quote from his letter. Philosophy is the highest, but even higher than philosophy is practice of philosophy. So he was pointing again and again that it's not just a phase, but it's something which is very practical and provable. As Radhika Raman so beautifully explained, that despite our Shastric grounding, we have a lot of room for empiric investigation. And basically, we have to prove that it's true by our own experience, by applying the philosophy. And of course, Srila Prabhupada, again and again, that was his very important point. He would say that Krishna consciousness is not dogmatic. Don't think that it is a scripture of Hindus. No. It is for all human beings. There is reason, there is science, there is philosophy. It's not dogmatic. So we can go on and on. We all know this point. We have no dogmatism, Srila Prabhupada says here. If you want to understand this Krishna consciousness on the basis of philosophy, logic, science, we are prepared to present it to you. So that was his way, but again, as I said, we see different tendencies now. The same sort of quote, this is science of the soul, it's not dogmatic, and he says again the same thing in Chaitanya, about Chaitanya Charitamrita. He says, religion often gives rise to dogmatism, but the author of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Krishnadas Kaviraja, urges us to try to understand Lord Chaitanya and the philosophy of Krishna consciousness according to logic. So that was Srila Prabhupada's presentation. but my initial premise was that we see the transformation of ISKCON into yet another religion. And in one sense, it's a natural process. It goes on, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he very beautifully explained this, that the idea of an organized church in an intelligible form indeed marks the close of the living spiritual movement. The great ecclesiastical establishments are the dikes and the dams to retain the current that cannot be held by any such contrivances. They indeed indicate a desire on the part of the masses to exploit a spiritual movement for their own purpose. That's a very important point from his essay. They also unmistakably indicate the end of the absolute and unconventional guidance of the bona fide spiritual teacher. So this is a very grave warning, and here Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada explains the reason that the masses are trying to exploit the genuine spiritual movement for their own purpose. So, basically what we see in the beginning when any genuine religion starts, due to the contact of its founder with the spiritual reality, it is a vibrant spiritual movement. Therefore, it attracts genuine seekers of truth and transforms their hearts. Due to their enthusiasm and preaching zeal, gradually many people join the religion, bringing their expectations and hopes. That's where the problem starts. The movement gains recognition and becomes accepted as a bona fide. It is usually considered as a sign of success by the members, but in most cases indicate the demise of genuine spiritual movement. It's basically rephrasing of what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says. What we're dealing here is the dynamic of demand creates supply. So what is the demand of the masses of people? The masses of people need salvation. The main motivation of the masses of people is to be saved from the sufferings of this world. And the preachers, consciously or subconsciously, sensing this demand, start assuring people that they can get guaranteed salvation here and only here. We all heard perhaps these sermons from Vyasa sons, which would claim that Krishna consciousness is the only way to be saved and everything else is false. And it is as a result of such presentation, which exploits the fears of people and of course answers their expectations and hopes, people join in masses, and the religion becomes very powerful institution of this world. That's what we see. Gradually it's happening with ISKCON. But the end result, the consequence of this is very sad. Again, from the same essay of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the church that has the best chance of survival in this damned world is that of atheism under the convenient guise of theism. So this is what can happen. The churches have always proved the staunchest upholders of the grossest form of worldliness, from which even the worst of non-ecclesiastical criminals are found to recoil. So, and this is what we see, and the next slide explains the difference between the search for truth and the religious approach. For those people who come to a spiritual movement with the need to be saved, with the need of salvation. They just want salvation and they hope for the better future. But of course, Srila Prabhupada didn't address this need. He was addressing people who have tried to find the truth. And the people who are convenient or conventional, religious practitioners, they're ready to pay the price for salvation. Basically, the price for salvation is to adhere to some dogmas and rules, and they're ready to pay it. If the religion promises you that you will be saved, okay, we will do this. But as a result, you get some fake result. You don't really get spiritual transformation. You just get these false promises. Whereas if we take the genuine search for truth, then the price to pay for it is the desire to deepening and increase desire to find the truth, and ultimately you will get something real. So this is perhaps the most important slide in the whole presentation, which shows the difference of religious approach and scientific search for truth. Even though externally it may sound similar, we may preach the same, scriptures and say even the same things, more or less. But there is a gulf of difference between these two approaches. Religious approach always stresses that you're already saved. Your salvation is guaranteed. You only should follow certain conditions. In our case, you should chant 16 rounds and not one round more. And you should follow 4 or 3.5 regulative principles, whatever you choose, or perhaps go to Mangalarati or whatever it is. And very important characteristic of this religious approach is that you're making the choice once. You made the choice, you made the right choice, you joined the right place, you joined the right religion, and if you join, you're saved. And if you don't, well, the hell is yours. And behind this approach, there is always the desire to absolve responsibility, the desire to take off the burden of responsibility. Usually people of this kind, they say, just tell me what to do, don't make such complicated philosophy, don't bewilder me, just tell me what to do, I will do it as long as you guarantee my salvation. And of course, spiritual organization and or immature spiritual teachers, they always claim that they will take all responsibility for you if you follow them without questioning. So the completely different approach is that when we treat the spiritual movement as the facilitation for us to find the truth. The spiritual movement gives only one guarantee, that it will help you in your search for truth. The choice is not once. You basically have to make the choice every minute, at least every day, what you choose. You have to be very introspective and to be, responsible for your actions, for your words, for your even thoughts. So we make the choices every day. Our search for truth does not end when we join a religious or spiritual organization. And the person who is of this attitude, he understands that this is my responsibility. I don't have to shift the responsibility to anyone else. and I will not blame anyone for my failure. And I'm free, I'm doing it of my choice, not because somebody else wanted me to do it. And of course, the religious organization or genuine religious or spiritual teacher will not take the whole burden of responsibility for the salvation, quote unquote, of the person upon his shoulders. He will just say that, I'm here to help you, but the result really depends on how correctly you're following the path and how properly you're understanding the science behind it. So this is basically, kind of common sense. We can see the same dynamic in Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning, Arjuna, who is the representative of this sort of beginners in the spiritual science, he just says, in this condition, I'm asking you, tell me for certain what is the best for me. Now I'm your disciple and the soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me. So I'm confused. Please tell me very clearly and I will follow you. And after speaking Bhagavad Gita, Krishna kind of turns it around and puts the burden of responsibility back upon Arjuna and says, I explained everything to you. I explained all the confidential knowledge. Deliberate on this fully and then do what you wish to do. So this is exactly the difference of the religious approach. And if Krishna was not Krishna, but if he was some of the, gurus of ISKCON, he would say, yes, 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 I will tell you, just follow me and I will save you. But Krishna is saying what he is saying. He is not taking the burden of responsibility. He is placing it back. And of course, Srila Prabhupada was the same. One very important and very grave difference between the religious approach and scientific approach is that religion is emphasizing the result. It always talks about the end result, but the science emphasizes the process. The result is the outcome of the process, and therefore Prabhupada, he was always emphasized the process, that we have to follow the process properly. And therefore he coined this phrase, techniques of spiritual life. He was basically, indicating that we should do some spiritual experiment and enjoy the result of this experiment if we do everything properly. Whereas the religion will always talk about the end result without emphasizing enough the need for practice. So this is a very beautiful quote from Charles Colton. Man will wrangle for religion, write for it, fight for it, die for it, anything but live for it. They will do anything for religion, but not practice religion in reality. And there are so many other differences which we can see. Usually religion is very obsessive about miracles. You need to show the miracles all the time, and if miracles don't happen, religious people, they always concoct some miracles or invent some miracles. Whereas spiritual science emphasizes not the miracles, but the real miracle, the change of the heart. And miracles is just, they may or may not be there, and we know how Prabhupada was very skeptical about miracles. And even though sometimes we hear so many different stories how Prabhupada showed this miracle or that miracle, but as far as Prabhupada himself was concerned, his miracle was the transformation of the heart, which is the real outcome of the scientific approach to Krishna conscious process. Then attitude towards scriptures is also very different. we can see very unsystematic approach towards scriptures in ISKCON very often. If we hear the average lecture, we just see some anecdotes or hear some anecdotes or collection of the stories. Very rarely we see some solid or hear some solid or even systematically given philosophy. Whereas for the spiritual seeker, for the seeker of truth, the scriptures is the source of a different worldview. And to create this worldview, to make this worldview work, you have to work hard and you have to systematically study the scriptures from beginning to end with understanding of logic and reasoning. And as a result of it, you will become Shastra Chakshu, you will have the eye of Shastra. Very peculiar thing about the rules and regulations in religion and in spiritual science. In religion, you will see two different approaches. First, it's usually fanatical following rules for the sake of rules, and then inventing different ways of circumventing restrictions which are not convenient. I heard a beautiful podcast with Noam Chomsky, who was totally disillusioned by the religion, because he says, he explains his anecdote of his life, and he says, from this interaction with the Orthodox Judaic tradition, which always tries to find some loopholes into the religious canons and rules, he said, I understand that religion is based on the assumption that God is an idiot. You always try to kind of cheat God by trying to find the loopholes into the scriptural rules. Whereas the spiritual science means that you understand the meaning of the rules, a rationale behind them, and the ability to discriminate the principles from details, which is so rare nowadays. And you try to do the concerted efforts to raise the standard of your personal sadhana. Completely different attitude towards religion, towards the saints. If we take religious approach, you will see that all the saints have to be flawless. They're usually nitya siddhas. They just came to save us. And then, if you see some little deviation from the imagined ideal, you become totally disillusioned and start blaming them and tell them, call them names. Whereas spiritual science uses the example of the saints as the source of inspiration. And for the spiritual scientist, for somebody who is searching for truth, the example of a saint is more important, where he is, encountering obstacles and fights with the temptations. Srila Prabhupada gives the example of Bilvamangal Thakur in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Actually, this is Rupa Goswami himself. And he says that this is the source of inspiration. Anyway, so there are so many different, differences, very important differences in approach. And perhaps most relevant for Bhaktivedanta Institute is that usually dogmatic religious practitioners are very afraid of science and condemning science, or adhering to some pseudo science, proving all kinds of strange or trying to prove strange theories, whereas the spiritual science have no fear of engaging in the sensible dialogue with the science and have no problems. And very important difference is that if we are members of religion, we will always openly or or maybe implicitly deprecate other religions and say that they're wrong, and because there is this rivalry. Whereas spiritual science knows that there are universal spiritual principles, and they're reflected in other religion to a certain extent, and we can discern the spiritual principles in other religions. So anyway, I will skip the whole thing. I just want to bring it to conclusion because my time is up. Is that, this is an important. For religious people, the formal initiation is very important. But development, genuine relationship with spiritual master and spiritual teachers are not as important. Whereas for those who are searching for truth, it's much more important to have a genuine relationship by which we gain the knowledge and experience rather than formalities of a particular religion. So what I see in reality, people usually join ISKCON as sincere seekers of truth. But oftentimes they come to our environment and the sincere spiritual seeker is turned into a religious fanatic because of the unhealthy atmosphere and the unhealthy ways of presenting Krishna consciousness in a very dogmatic way. You cannot ask questions, you cannot doubt, just follow this and that. And, we can see this is actually an unfortunate result of all religions. Only 6% of religious practitioners are sincere seekers of truth, and 94 in average are, the masses of people. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada gave a solution which is relevant to Bhaktivedanta Institute and its mission. He says in the letter to Swarup Damodar about Bhaktivedanta Institute in particular, I'm satisfied that you properly understanding the philosophy, and we have introduced the system of examinations, and he says, consider how to organize this Bhaktivedanta Institute by giving these degrees. What I see, I don't want to make a blanket statement. I'm sure there are nice courses, but I also see that there is more and more courses on Bhakti Shastri, Bhakti Vaibhava, and everything else, which are very dogmatic, which just gives the surface of the Shastra without going deeply. And Bhaktivedanta Institute has to preach to the scientists, but not only to the scientists. The members of Bhaktivedanta Institute have to establish this culture of preaching Krishna consciousness as a science to the devotees. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada again says this, that the Bhaktivedanta Institute is open for everyone, and it's open including those who have already entered our temples. They may also participate in our programs. So the main point of my presentation is that before it's too late, we have to do something, and we have to revive the culture of preaching Krishna consciousness as the science, by understanding it as the science ourselves, without making it as a another pseudo religious phase or pseudo religion, which is, as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada said, is the main fortress of atheism. And that's why Srila Prabhupada said, I'm repeating it again, to the members of Bhaktivedanta Institute, the next phase is yours. I finished my preaching, I did what I was supposed to do. Now you take this further and you preach and establish our movement as a genuine scientific movement, including our members, because what is the use if we try to present Krishna consciousness as the science to everyone else and our own members don't understand this and make Krishna consciousness into a mockery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maharaj. Okay, a number of very important and challenging statements and thoughts there. We're now going to invite our other members as a panel. So if the host could arrange, I'm going to introduce Guru Prasad Raghavan, who is now on your screen. He wasn't a speaker today, but he was with us at the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, made a wonderful presentation there. He has a PhD in neuroscience and bioengineering from Caltech. He's now the co-founder of the company Yurt AI. So he is the person to understand all the issues of what AI can and cannot do, and has been a long-time collaborator with the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies, and I've known him for some years, and he has been highly instrumental in providing us information and direction for the development of the BI, and particularly I'm grateful for his inputs for the Atma paradigm. Are the other members of the panel joining us also? I'm looking to the host of our conference to help them come in. Thank you. We've got Hridayananda Goswami, Bhaktivedanta Goswami. Is Ramcharita joining us? Possibly not. Well, let's if he does at some point, we can involve him in the discussion. We've got about half an hour to play with. I'd like, thank you, Ramcharita, thanks for joining us. I'd like to perhaps start on a topic that we've just heard from Bhaktivedanta Goswami, and asking a little bit more from each of you, how you feel the BI can play a role. It has multiple audiences. Obviously, we have the academic community, we have the general public, we have even our own internal scientists group. But we also have a responsibility perhaps to the general members of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So how can the BI play a role for helping all of these different audience cohorts in understanding that what is on offer from this movement is a spiritual science? Who would like to go first? Maybe I'll go to Hridayananda Maharaj and ask you if you'd like to comment on that question.
I was hoping to go last, actually, but I'd like to hear from the others. I thought the topic, I mean, what you said is not that different, but the idea of the necessity of, okay, well, I'll offer a few words since you called on me. I think it would be good to identify different tasks that we have. For example, what I focused on today was just sort of general arguments from the field of epistemology in terms of physical and metaphysical epistemologies, and which I think are important and true in a sense, regardless of our philosophy. But I know Ramcharita, he presented a sort of a more precise way of understanding, at least sort of showed an example of a more precise way of understanding our specific theology. And so that I see the importance of that, because ultimately we have to also explain what our specific views are. And our presentation has to be really more precise. An example of that was, although he's not here right now, Radhika Raman, who's talking about pramanas, different forms of evidence. So in a, let's say in a serious philosophy of religion context or philosophical theology context, just to say that, you know, Krishna is God, or another example is to say that, let's say our philosophy is ontology is beta, there's difference and non-difference. And of course, as Ramcharita always points out, you know, those terms are problematic unless you get much more specific about it. So I think it's a question of different audiences and, you know, different purposes. I know one time I was with Prabhupada and he was engaged in what have come to be called the life comes from life talks, when he was attacking the notion that life can come from dead matter. And I remember that someone asked him about Krishna, and he didn't want to talk about Krishna until he first presented a refutation of the materialistic view. So I personally have identified several, you call them battlefields, or several crucial areas in which we have to have a voice. One is because, I mean, in every age, I would say in every age, there's something which you could call sort of the sociology of knowledge equivalent of Vedanta. I mean, 1,000 years ago, at the time of Ramanuja, and even earlier Shankara, and responding to Shankara. And then, of course, Madhvacharya, who I think is less perhaps relevant to us than Ramanuja. But these were key points. But again, the discussion, the debate in India at that time among the most serious, you could say, philosophers or intellectuals, it was based on coming up with a correct understanding of the Upanishads, which is, I mean, Vedanta, ultimately the Prasthana Traya, these three literally Prasthana points of departure. For the Upanishads, you have the Upanishads, what do they mean? Because that's the Jnana Kanda, that's the knowledge portion of the Vedas. So if someone is claiming to have knowledge, they have to show that their notion of knowledge is consistent with the knowledge portion of the Vedas, the Jnana Kanda. So you have the Upanishads themselves, the sort of very esoteric, condensed commentary, which is Brahma Sutras, then you have the Bhagavad Gita. Nowadays, there's nothing like a consensus in the world that, well, the knowledge is in the Upanishads, we just have to figure out what the Upanishads mean. I mean, there's nothing like a consensus. And so therefore, the battlefield or the area of Vedanta, which you could translate even as the sort of like the highest point of debate or discussion about what constitutes knowledge, in a sense, it's because the world has become degraded and there's no consensus. I mean, there was never a consensus about the Upanishads outside of India. But now everything has been thrown into doubt. And so I mentioned this in my talk, like every philosophical community, and by that I just mean people who have some understanding of philosophy and talk to each other and, you know, are interested in communicating with each other. So every philosophical community has to have a starting point, just like every problem in geometry, what's given. And so the given in any community of philosophy is just what everyone agrees on. What everyone agrees on depends on their level of understanding, their level of realization. Like, do they understand there's a God? Do they dispute the idea? Do they accept the world as real? Do they dispute that? Do they, and so on and so forth. So I would say that the level of consensus, which is the sort of epistemic starting point, the foundational starting point, is very low. Because the world has become so materialistic, it's a very low point. And so just to finish up, I'm going on and on. So I think there are 5 areas where we have to engage. One is you say cosmogenesis, how did the universe get here? Another one is I would call it biogenesis. How do you get the first life forms? And then once you have life forms, another battlefield is what do you call it? Evolutionary biology. Then there's the mind-body problem, which has become extremely important. And I mean, you could also include perhaps the debate over God. Is the notion of God coherent? Are there coherent ideas of God that somehow fit whatever else we now think or believe we know?
Those are good topics and part of the BI agenda. Guru Prasad, taking this point that Maharaj is saying that previously there was an agreed kind of starting point. Would you say from your experience working at Caltech and working in the world in AI that most people take current scientific theories as being the given, and that everything has to then conform with the interpretations that are given to them?
Thank you, Provost. First of all, I'm very, very excited to be in such an august presence. I've never actually been with such people and communicating on an equal platform. So it's really awesome. Really happy to be here. So on the note of, I think what Maharaj mentioned earlier and what you've alluded to, I think it's definitely the scientific community believes that yes, the things that have stood the test of time could be 100 years, papers or research that has happened. Those are things that we're going to ground ourselves on, and it's very hard to break those notions or get away from those notions. For instance, either more than Darwin's theory, it's about like the development of the DNA as a blueprint, for instance, in the 1960s, and now that's become such a core tenet that no one's going to suddenly, like, it's very difficult to change dogmas in science. And we actually call it the central dogma of, they say DNA to RNA to protein. That's like the dogma. And then afterwards, when you say, and that's like the basis of how life functions. So we are definitely playing a very different game than our preceptors, our great philosophers in 1000 AD, because there was something that they all believed and accepted as, okay, so here's our source of truth, and we have now interpreted this differently. Right now, we don't even have a commonly agreeing source of truth. Our source of truth in the scientific community is like classic papers, but then in the philosophical field, many people don't even probably have access, or they don't even bother with reading those texts as well. So there's like, we're basically shooting arrows, but no one's actually knowing where we need to. How do we find this common corpus of text that we can all agree upon? If we crack this, we will be able to like agree to disagree on certain aspects. I think that's where a lot of the challenge is, because and every scientist is nuanced in their own way. Like, especially like now we have so many silos. We have evolutionary biology, like Maharaj mentioning, if evolutionary biology, where there are a gazillion theories. And although we know, like in the spiritual community, we speak about certain kinds of theories, but then the field, if you look at the latest review in evolutionary biology, it's there's a modification to how they're also thinking about evolution, how evolution happened, and how genetic diversity happens. Then there's mind-body interface itself, which is a lot of there's a huge silo of scientists who do not even accept that the mind exists beyond the brain. Everything is just matter at that point. And even proving or trying to kind of prod in that direction is something that we would have to first, we need to agree upon. These are the experiments that are, first of all, I agree with and two different scientists have to agree upon these experiments are well thought of, reproducible. That's the starting point. Then we can actually argue upon, okay, what do we interpret from the evidence that we see from this experiment? But a lot of times there's even those things might not we may not have common ground right there. So it is a very it's an interesting problem that we need to kind of address on that front.
Now, could this be addressed by researchers, academic scholars, all being clearer on what their commitments are? Because each researcher is coming at an issue or a challenge or a problem or a question from the position of their belief commitments, that they accept certain things as fundamental or valid, and they're going to build up their understanding from that. Ricardo, it's that something that comes into the sort of project that you're working on, where you're actually dealing with much more esoteric aspects of the nature of God and cosmic consciousness?
Yeah, in a way, I would say yes, but I think everything has to do with, as I tried to point out in my presentation, uh, has to do with the public and the audience, the target audience. And in philosophy, I mean, it's nowadays, it's easier to deal with these issues because we have this field, philosophy of religion, and is an interdisciplinary field. In philosophy of religion, there are philosophy of mind issues, ontological issues, epistemological issues, and so on and so forth. So we have a kind of freedom to deal with. Of course, we have to be rigorous in terms of the concept that we use, in terms of the arguments we give, and so on and so forth. But as far as the themes are concerned, we have more freedom. I would say that things are a bit different when we deal with another fields like scientific fields. Of course, I would say that religious studies, it's even easier than in philosophy. I mean, to deal with like concepts like God and heaven and soul, whatever. But and I think that seems to be the main concern of the PI science, right? And I would say that it's harder, and because we are trying to mix science with the religion in a sense, because of course our worldview is a theistic worldview. And referring to your question, the first question you posed before start speaking about how the PI can fulfill its goal. I just point out the following. It's so hard. I mean, if you take a PhD, for instance, you have to start for 4 years just to know well a research field. And of course, this is required if you want to be like to give a real contribution, and we want to be taken seriously, right? So I would say that in one sense, it's just my view. The PI has a quite broad scope. I mean, it deals with so many stuff, but to be taken seriously in any field, I mean, it takes time. And of course, there is one good side if you're addressing like the public audience, the devotees, and so many different science and philosophy and theology. That's wonderful. However, again, in order to be taken seriously in any field, it requires hard work. It's really hard. So I would say that as an advice, as a piece of advice, pick 1, 2, 3 fields, and within those fields, try to pick 1 or 2 questions, because there's a very big specialization, and any field has subfields and sub-subfields, and within those fields there are so many different questions. And when we were talking about like academic work, people, they work like for 20 years just in one of those specific issues. So I would say keep like trying to do this general work, but at the same time, like choose 1 or 2 specific topics within specific fields, and in this way try to be relevant within those fields.
I would like, if I could respond just for a second to both the speakers, because I'd like to present a different view. I mean, not in opposition. I don't disagree with anything that you said, Ramcharita, and I don't agree with anything that certainly the Guru Prasad Raghavan. I put a quote in chat right now, which I'm going to read to you, which I just found in a second. It said, Carl Sagan, himself worried about opinion polls showing that only about 10% of Americans believe in a strictly materialistic evolutionary process. And as Lewontin's, whoever he is, anecdote concedes, some of the doubters have advanced degrees in the relevant sciences. Dissent, as widespread as that, must rest on something less easily remedied than mere ignorance of facts. And so I, as a student of history, I think that, I mean, I agree with that approach that Ramcharita, but I also think that process is going to take forever. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but there's another view. If you look at history, let's focus in, for example, on the 18th century. And especially as we get toward the end of the 18th century, where you had the Western universities controlled by the church, basically. And at the same time, all of the most important intellectual activity was going on outside the church. certainly the field of philosophy, the whole age of enlightenment and you know, the Enlightenment project and all that. And so I think that that technique of, let's say, really burrowing in, really narrowing down to a very technical field, what I'm thinking, I think there's two things you have to look at. One is, how do we get directly influence in the universities? You know, how do we publish papers and referee journals? But there's another thing, and that is what are the mechanisms of history? Like if you look at intellectual revolutions as a historian, what you find is that the universities often are very much subject to what's going on outside the university. And so I'm not against what Ramcharita said. I think that's part of it, but I also think that by making the case to the reading public, or let's say to people who are not just rednecks, like intelligent people, when you start to create a powerful consensus or view, it actually changes academia also. And I won't go into all the details of how history functions, but it's true. So I think the exclusive focus on becoming respectable in universities and publishing papers and referee journals. I know in the humanities, only I think 10% of articles published in referee journals are even quoted one time, or 80% are never quoted, or something like that. So I know myself, I want to take my case to reasonably intelligent people and create sort of a socio-historical pressure. And ultimately, I think that's something we can do immediately. It's something that allows us not to get lost in the technicalities, because you can dedicate your whole life, as Ramcharita said, on very, very narrow technical points. And ultimately, the people you're influencing or trying to influence die, and the people that replace them may just have completely different issues. And you can achieve these little victories, but hardly anyone in the world knows or cares that you did. So like I said, 90% of the people in America actually don't buy the nonsense of just, totally physicalist evolution. I mean, very few people do. I've hardly met anyone that does. And I travel around and lecture. So I think that in order to come up with the BI strategy, I mean, I agree with Ramcharita. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying, though, that we have to have a sophisticated knowledge of the socio-historical methods by which knowledge disseminates and how societies actually change. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you. Bhakti Vigana Maharaj, perhaps you started.
Hey, Bhakti Vigana, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Perhaps you started this discussion. Have you any specific hopes for the BI in terms of creating this kind of broader understanding within the public of a need for a spiritual science, or at least a science of the nature of our spiritual existence as consciousness?
Or balance, or I would say just balancing physics and metaphysics.
What I see as a need of an hour is that we have, I see a very strange culture which is developing more or less spontaneously. There is no systematic approach to our scriptures. There is no understanding of scriptures from the logical point of view. And I think we should revive the training, especially of the preachers. And usually, preachers who are presenting Krishna consciousness to the outside world or inside audiences, they're not trained themselves. They just have some charisma, they have some, ability to speak and to convince people. So I think the mission of BI has to bring this culture of scientific discourse into the circles of inside the society, especially among the preachers, because the culture which we have now is just to have some quotes, some Sanskrit verses, and some stories in between, and to make people laugh and get dakshina as a result. So,
That was brutally frank.
For the last part of our discussion, I wanted to kind of develop what you're just saying, Maharaj, and really look at why we have actually set up this particular session on Shastra, hermeneutics, epistemology, understanding the philosophy of science. And many of our listeners and attendees may be feeling that we haven't focused that much on specific scientific topics, but we're trying to understand how to appreciate our own kind of sources of knowledge, and at the same time the pratyakshana and anumana by which we're under and experiencing the world. So could I ask each of you now just to kind of speak a little bit about the role of epistemology, particularly we heard from Radhika Raman about the three pramanas of pratyaksha, anumana, and shabda, and the way that they relate to one another, and the way that in our, if you like, progress in the spiritual science, how we would relate to those three, and particularly how are we to cope with issues within our Shastra that we might find challenging, difficult to reconcile in our minds. So if I could have comments from each of you on that topic, that would be very helpful. Who would like to go first?
I can start if more senior people will allow me. According to Jiva Goswami, his definition of Shabda is Vaidusha Pratyaksha. He says Shabda is actually the Pratyaksha or experience, real life experience of Vaidusha, of the people who are realized. If we understand that Shastra is not just a revelation which was revealed to somebody, and if we understand that Shabda Pramana means that this revelation has to become my revelation. Sometimes I think we have a wrong approach that Shabda Pramana means that I study, the revealed truths, and by studying theoretically the revealed truths, I kind of also become a part of it. But in reality, it has to become my experience. So Shabda has to become my experience because it is the experience of great people, and it hints in which direction I have to go in my own search for truth. As Radhika Raman Prabhu said, that actually Pratyaksha has a very important role. We should not think that Shabda is just dogma. When we treat Shabda as a dogma, as a set of dogmas which we have to remember, memorize, and repeat every, Sunday or whatever, then we're just, we're not serving the truth. My opinion is that we have to stress this point that we have to realize Shabda, we have to, yes, some of the parts of our scriptures perhaps we will never realize, but at least we have to sincerely attempt to practice this and to, as much as possible, to prove by our own experience that this is true, not just be satisfied that it is said by some great people and written in some great books of the past.
Thank you very much. Any others like to come in on this?
Yeah, perhaps I might say one or two words. Well, about epistemology, and perhaps I could refer to a very key philosophical term, which is first philosophy. For instance, Descartes dialogues, they were called dialogues on the first philosophy. And very quickly, in the beginning, first philosophy was more or less ontology. Then, starting from with Descartes, it was replaced by epistemology. And then in 20th century, it was replaced by philosophy of language. Why I'm saying that? Because, of course, communicating and being taken seriously by scientists or whatever requires language. We use language. So I sometimes, as an academic, I have a hard time to understand precisely some of our principles or dogmas. So what I mean to say is, in my view, we need to come with more clear descriptions of our theology. And I think this should come first before we talk about ways to validate Shabda or ways to validate what is said in our scriptures. We have to try to say more clearly what our scriptures say. And this is a kind of reconstruction job or trying, and of course, Christian philosophers and theologians, they did that for centuries. And if we want to communicate, if we want to present our philosophy, theology to others, and to scientists, or in a scientific way or in academic way, we should to ourselves present our theology in I can give many examples of why this is needed. But I think language, in this sense, should precede epistemology, and even
if I could respond to that, as you know, I would, because we have very different views of Wittgenstein. I agree, of course. Obviously, the call for clear, precise language. Who could disagree with that? At the same time, I think that again, it can be it's necessary. You just published a paper, which is very good, trying to be very precise about what our theology is, exactly what our conception of God is. At the same time, I wonder, like, how many people are listening, and so I guess the way I was trained by Prabhupada, and maybe my own nature, is I'm very concerned with actually changing history. I don't want to say I'm like Marx in that way, because I'm kind of afraid of resembling Marx in any way. But the notion that that we actually have to change history, and so to me the question is, how should I put it? When I get very technical about our philosophy, exactly what do we mean by God, exactly, and I think the emphasis on language in the 20th century in Western philosophy was exaggerated and became counterproductive. That's my view. I'm more the Thomas Reid type person, sort of like common sense philosophy. Thomas Reid was one of the famous persons that responded to Hume and thought Hume was kind of nonsensical, David Hume. But so as far as what should we focus on now? Is it language? Is it ontology? I think it's all historically situated. There has to be a definition of a task, because, for example, 1,000 years ago in India, or 500 years ago in India, they were very serious intellectuals, theologians, philosophers, were very concerned about certain technical things that don't mean anything to us today. And so the fact, I think that to me, the degeneration from ontology to epistemology to language, to me, in a sense, it represents not progress in philosophy, as we've discussed before. To some extent, not absolutely, but to some extent, I think it's a degeneration. It's a disintegration of philosophy. And again, the consensus of what we can all agree on is just going lower and lower and lower and lower. And it's not that, wow, before Wittgenstein, no one realized when you talk about language. I think before Wittgenstein, a lot of people had much more common sense. And that's why we didn't talk about it, not because they hadn't discovered how important language is. Then one thing I wanted to say about, Ron, sorry, I'll go on like this, I'm sure, for decades.
If possible, I'd like to respond just a very short
Go Sure.
Very short. I'm not talking about technicality, not at all, because different groups will require different degrees of language precision, so to speak. However, I argue that some degree of precision should be there. And I give an example. For instance, if we're talking to like an intelligent person, we're trying to explain our Bida, which is the key, perhaps, the key aspect of our theology, right? And if it's the person is intelligent enough, perhaps he or she would ask something like that. But you are saying that it's different and non-different at the same time, or it's different and non-different senses, or sense. Sorry. And if so, what is the difference between those two different?
Okay. If I can respond to that, yeah.
So my point is, we should, even though we might not give those details to everyone, we should be ready to give them if it is needed.
Okay, but in response, I probably, in my illustrious career of harassing people, preaching, I've probably explained beta, I'm sure thousands of times, and I swear to God, I can't remember a single time that someone said that doesn't make any sense to me. I've given Prabhupada I'm sure if I explained it to sophisticated philosophers, we'd go on for 50 years arguing about it. But in terms of normal people and even normal educated people, I'm sure I presented it thousands of times. I can't think of one instance where someone said to me, that doesn't make sense, or what do you mean qualitatively, like Prabhupada saying qualitatively one, quantitatively different, I can't remember ever in my life that someone had a problem with that. So again, I think that if we just try to convince these sophisticated, I would say almost like obsessively problematizing philosophers, we're going to die long before we convince them, and the world won't be really benefited. In the meantime, I think there are tens, or if not, tens of or hundreds of millions of people out there who actually are open to a common sense explanation. So again, if you know that, Thomas Reid and Hume, it's, I think that we have to know enough philosophy to be intelligent, to reply, but the revolution is really not in the academy. Right now, the academy is under this heavy criticism because of its, for one thing, because of its very leftist political agenda. But I think we have to be sensitive to the history of knowledge. In other words, where the power centers. And right now, I think the revolution is not just convincing a few elite intellectuals that hold positions in departments, because they'll die before they have any real influence. And so I think we have to be intelligent, sophisticated sufficiently, but bring the message. And just one last thing, and I promise I'll stop. And that is Bhakti Vigana, my good old friend Bhakti Vigana, said that we have to revive learning. If only ISKCON history were that good that we had something to revive. Because even when Prabhupada was here, I remember in my presence, he would always complain that his disciples didn't even read his books, which are obviously not academic. And so to say there was a golden age of ISKCON where devotees actually read books, if only. I think we really have to do something new now and create a true learned Brahmin class, which has never existed in the Hare Krishna movement.
All right, I'm going to move to Guru Prasad, who's very patiently had his hand
Very
up.
patient.
So thank you so much, Prabhu. So I have quickly 3 comments to make. One is, I think, reflecting on one of the points that Hriday Maharaj mentioned was, if we go into a topic and if the goal is to write papers, there are plenty of papers out here, right? But if you think about why is evolutionary theory so famous right now? And I believe, this is my understanding, not a single person who actually speaks about evolutionary theory, like I would say not just common men, but even intellectuals, they don't read papers to actually come to that conclusion. They've read Selfish Gene, they've read Richard Dawkins. So they've read these writers who've kind of propagated a very interesting idea and theory out there. and it's become one of the, so I think that's another way to capture, I would say, if you want to bring it out to the masses in some ways, if you want to bring out some ideas and concepts, it's not just paper writing, but it is also about how do we actually set the storyline given, that's one way, like looking at Richard Dawkins, at least I'm seeing parallels there. The other thing I just wanted to say was regarding the question itself about Pratyaksha, Anumana, and Shabda. It seems science struggles with subjectivity. We don't know how to deal with it. That's the honest problem, because feelings, emotions, revelations, all of these are just, I don't know what to mean, what it means, because we all have an experience and no one's denying that. But my experience is very different from yours. So I love what Bhakti Vigyan Maharaj mentioned about how Shabda is actually Vaidushya Pratyaksha. It's such a beautiful thing. But then again, my scientific head is like, how do I ever know what Maharaj felt and what I'm feeling? Like, there's no way to compare those things. So if I can't compare them, and if there's no third party who can actually empirically validate that, that means it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't exist. So we cannot actually come to a conclusion. We can't speak about it. Of course, the question, then I think, to tie that with what Hridayan Maharaj and Ricardo Prabhu said was, we maybe need to have some threads that we can kind of sync on. What are those things, that commonalities that we can kind of speak about? I think that's where we need to kind of develop a framework. So, as devotees, as community, as people in the community, we can actually speak about these things without having those biases of, oh, if I don't feel this way, I'm not there. And I think those are other stress points that we also feel within the community, is what my opinion is. But yes, that's, thank you for giving me the
Thank
chance.
you very much. I think it's very clear, and it has been clear to the BI that we have different audiences identified as 4, as I mentioned earlier, and that we may need different approaches and different degrees of precision or broadness in dealing with each of those to be successful. We now have to finish. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and it's a shame when we've got such a great panel here today. We could go on all night, but I am going to ask you, in the typical mood of a panel host, to now give one sentence, and I'm serious, one sentence. If I hear anything that sounds like a full stop, we move on. One sentence which you would like to offer as a takeaway from today's session for the audience. What would you like the attendees today to take away from the session and the things that they've heard in the last 3 hours?
I'll go last. That was my sentence.
You're finished.
Okay, that's mine. Try to think hardly about the issues that bother you from an intellectual point of view.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I think I interrupted you at the beginning.
Oh, sure. Just try to think hard about the theological issues that bother you. I mean, perhaps we won't have an answer, but thinking, it's worth it.
That's great. Thank you. Bhakti Vigyan Maharaj.
Well, Krishna consciousness is a great science, and we should try hard not to bring it down to the level of ordinary religion.
Thank you. Guru Prasad.
This is hard. Maybe give me a few moments. I'd let Maharaj. I mean, Hridayan Maharaj is much better at this.
Me, Kandidi?
Yes, please.
In the spirit of Prabhupada, I think we should be rigorous. We should do really important work, but we always have to have one eye on the fate of the world and follow Prabhupada in the sense of being learned, making cogent arguments, and all that in a way which takes into account the real sociology and historical reality of the transmission of knowledge, and not just become frivolous and satisfy our own intellectual curiosity. Full stop.
Thank you. Guru Prasad, I'm afraid I'm back to you.
Yes. I think the main takeaway for me is, or for all of us, could be trying to blend what we have in science, or the way we understand today's academic science, and theology as we have it, is a very hard problem. And I think one needs to finally rely on, there is a lot of experience, and there's a lot of, it's a very nuanced topic. We should not try to artificially combine both of them. And there are parallels to be drawn, but one should not just force one is to one comparison between academic science and what we have in theology.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Candida, you want to take a shot?
Take away from this. Oh, I think I very much appreciated the different views that we've had today, and what we've wanted to, I think, convey is that we each have to develop our own realizations, and we have to be very careful not thinking that the way I read Shastra means that I have actually understood it in truth, but to ensure that I explore these topics in the association of others. I think it's so important to hear the perspectives, the insights, and understandings that others have got from their study of Shastra and of science, and how that works together to give us an understanding of what this world is actually about. There is a verse in the 11th canto, and Maharaj, you will know it because you helped phrase the translation, in the 28th chapter, which says that by all our pratyaksha, by all our anumana, by all our shabda, understanding of shabda, and also by our own internal realizations, we should come to know that this universe is asat. That's ultimately the conclusion. It's not a question of does it work like this, or which theory works or is valid or true. All of that is up for grabs. But ultimately, all of our ways of knowing this world is to help us understand that it is temporary. And because it is temporary, it has a cause, and that we are beyond the temporary material world.
Therefore, we need to work spiritually. Yes.
So now let me do a little promotion for next week. We continue with the summer school on Saturday, same time, and on Sunday also at the same time that we did today. On Saturday, we are covering the science, and particularly the life sciences of the Srimad Bhagavatam. We've got some very good, very interesting sessions on that, which will include a little bit more on the hermeneutic approach, consciousness-based life and speciation, the research that has been carried out on the effects of chanting the Mahamantra, natural and artificial intelligence and modeling, and Guru Prasad, who's with us today, will be speaking on that. And then sessions on Indic archaeology and Vedic archaeology with Rita Jenny and also Michael Cremo, Chudakarmapu. And rounding it off for the day will be our own Murli Gopal Das, Mauricio Garrido, speaking on his new publication, Krishna and the Quark. On Sunday, it's cosmology and a little look at how you can all become involved in the BI network. So on the cosmology side, we'll be looking at a consciousness-based universe with Giridhari Das, cosmogenesis, what happens before this universe happened, and the insights of the Bhagavatam on that. Some new ideas from Doug Watson and Laura Dominic. And we'll hear more about the BI in Russia. There will be an overview of some of the work that the Institute of Science and Philosophy in India are doing. We'll hear about the Science Museum of the Vedic Planetarium. and the project there, which includes also the ideas and the development of the chandelier project for the Temple of Vedic Planetarium. And we'll have a little panel just to tidy up everything and talk about the BI network, its resources, and the opportunities for everyone to become very deeply involved within it, because ultimately that is our hope for this summer school, to make the resources, the projects, the association that the Bhaktivedanta Institute can offer you to help each of us make further progress in the spiritual science. So with that, I thank you all very much and thank the team behind the scenes doing all the technical work and the promotion. They've done brilliantly today. And thank you to all our panelists and presenters for today. I hope that we have not committed any offenses or caused any problems